in the sun-soaked paradise of St. Lucian, where palm trees whisper secrets and cocktails hide deadly truths, a murderer stalks the Golden Coconut Resort. When a boastful colonel collapses, his glass laced with a sinister poison, only Miss Jane Marple, sharp-eyed and unyielding, senses the darkness beneath the island's charm. Who is the killer hiding among the glamorous actress, the secretive botanist, and the nervous staff? Why does a decades-old photograph hold the key to a string of murders? And can Miss Marple unravel the poisoner's trap before paradise claims another victim? Dive into a tropical mystery where every sip could be your last. Chapter 1. Rival in St. Lucian. Seaplanes' engines hummed a reluctant farewell as they sputtered to a stop, their drone replaced by the rhythmic lapping of waves against the wooden jetty. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible straw hat tilted slightly against the Caribbean sun, stepped carefully onto the sun-bleached planks of St. Lucian's modest dock. The air was thick with the scent of salt, hibiscus, and something faintly sweet, overripe mangoes, perhaps, or the promise of intrigue. At 74, Miss Marple was not one for tropical holidays, but her nephew Raymond, ever solicitous, had insisted. "And Jane," he'd said, his voice crackling through the telephone from London, "you've been looking peaky. A spell in the sun will do wonders." And so, here she was, on an island so small it barely warranted egg on the map, her knitting bag slung over one arm and her curiosity as sharp as ever. St. Lucian was a crescent of emerald and gold, its beaches fringed with palms that swayed like gossiping matrons. The Golden Coconut Resort, her destination, perched on a low cliff overlooking a lagoon so clear it seemed to hold the sky captive. As Miss Marple followed the porter, a weary youth named Emile, whose smile was as bright as his coral pink shirt, she noted the vibrant chaos of the islands. "Welcome!" Parrots squawked from breadfruit trees, and a steel drum band played a jaunty tune near a cluster of thatched roof bars. Yet, beneath the postcard perfection, there was a tremor of unease, like a false note in an otherwise cheerful melody. Emile's chatter faltered when he mentioned the resort's recent renovations, his eyes darting to the side as if expecting someone to overhear. The resort's lobby was an open-air affair, all teak and rattan, with ceiling fans stirring the humid air. A young woman at the reception desk, her name tag reading Leela, greeted Miss Marple with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the Golden Coconut, Miss Marple," she said, her accent a soft lilt that carried the island's cadence. "Your bungalow is ready, number 7, with a view of the lagoon." Miss Marple thanked her, noting the slight tremor in Lila's hands as she handed over a brass key shaped like a palm frond. A nervous girl, she thought, and not without reason, perhaps. As Emile led her along a crushed shell path to her bungalow, Miss Marple took stock of her fellow guests. A group lounged by the infinity pool, their voices carrying over the splash of water. A tall, silver-haired man in a linen suit held court, his booming laugh punctuated by military anecdotes. "Colonel Reginald Hawthorne," Emile whispered, unprompted. "Retired, very loud, likes his rum." Nearby, a woman in a wide-brimmed hat sipped a cocktail, her sunglasses reflecting the pool's shimmer. "That's Margot Steele," Emile continued, lowering his voice. "Film star. She's here to escape the spotlight, but she brings her own." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the actress's poised elegance and the faint tension in her posture, as if she were always on stage. A third figure caught her eye, a woman in khaki trousers and a sun-faded blouse, her hair tied back with a scarf. She sat alone, scribbling in a notebook, her brow furrowed. "Dr. Clara Vines," Emile said, his tone cautious. botanist, studies plants, but strange ones, poisonous, some say. Miss Marple's interest piqued. A botanist. On a pleasure island? There was a story there, she was certain. Her bungalow was a charming affair, with whitewashed walls and a veranda draped in bougainvillea. Inside, the furniture was simple but comfortable. A wicker chair, a teak desk, and a bed draped in mosquito netting that billowed like a wedding veil. Miss Marple unpacked her knitting, a habit as much for thinking as for creating, and settled onto the veranda with a cup of tea brought by a silent maid. The lagoon stretched before her, its surface unbroken save for the occasional leap of a silver fish. Yet, as she sipped her tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that St. Lucian was not all it seemed. The island's beauty was a mask, and masks, as Miss Marple well knew, were made to be lifted. That evening, the resort hosted a welcome dinner under a canopy of fairy lights. The guests gathered around long tables laden with platters of grilled snapper, mango salsa, and coconut rice. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and a light shawl for even tropical evenings could turn chilly, took a seat near the Colonel, who was already regaling the table with tales of his days in India. Shot a tiger once, you know, he bellowed, his mustache quivering. Beast was stalking a village. Took it down with one bullet. His audience, a mix of amused and bored, nodded politely. Margot Steele, seated opposite, toyed with her fork, her eyes distant. Dr. Vines, at the table's end, ate sparingly, her gaze fixed on her plate as if it held secrets. The conversation turned to the island's history, prompted by a local waiter who mentioned an old sugar plantation in the hills. Haunted, they say, he added with a grin, though his eyes flicked nervously to the shadows beyond the canopy. Colonel Hawthorne scoffed. Ghosts, poppycock. But I'll tell you something, real met a murderer once, right here in the Caribbean. Had a photograph of the blighter, too. Face you'd never forget. He patted his jacket pocket, as if the photograph were there, then froze, his hand stilling. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, her ears attuned to the sudden shift in his tone. Before she could probe, a steel drum band struck up a lively tune, and the guests were ushered to a dance floor lit by tiki torches. Miss Marple declined to dance, preferring to observe from her seat. She noticed Leela, the receptionist, hovering near the bar, her hands twisting a dishcloth. The girl's eyes darted to the Colonel, who was now laughing with a young couple, his earlier unease forgotten. Margot Steele, meanwhile, excused herself, slipping into the darkness beyond the torches. Dr. Vines followed a moment later, her movements deliberate. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind weaving a pattern as intricate as her stitches. The evening's merriment reached a crescendo when the Colonel, flushed with rum, stood to propose a toast. To St. Lucian, he roared, raising a glass of amber liquid. To paradise and its secrets. He took a hearty swig, then froze, his face contorting. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the stone floor. He clutched his throat, gasping, and collapsed, his chair toppling with a crash that silenced the band. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple was on her feet in an instant, her shawl slipping to the ground. "Call a doctor," someone shouted. But Miss Marple was already at the Colonel's side, her fingers searching for a pulse. His eyes were wide, unseeing, his lips tinged blue. The air carried a faint, acrid scent like bitter almonds, but sharper, almost chemical. She glanced at the shattered glass, its contents seeping into the stone. Poison, she thought, her heart steady despite the chaos around her. Not a heart attack. As the resort's manager, a portly man named Mr. Carver, was quick to declare. Tragic, Mr. Carver said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. The colonel had a weak heart. I'm told. These things happen. He waved for the staff to clear the area, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the glass shards. She bent down, feigning a stumble, and slipped a fragment into her handkerchief. The bitter almond scent clung to it. Unmistakable. Cyanide, perhaps. Or something more exotic. Dr. Vine's domain, she mused. As the guests were herded back to their bungalows, Miss Marple caught Lilla's eye. The girl was trembling, her dishcloth now a knotted mess. Did you see anything, my dear? Miss Marple asked gently, her tone that of a kindly aunt. Lila hesitated, then whispered, There was a man near the colonel's bungalow this afternoon. Not a guest. He was watching. Her voice broke, and she fled into the kitchen. Miss Marple returned to her bungalow, the glass shard tucked safely in her knitting bag. She sat on the veranda, the lagoon now a dark mirror reflecting the stars. The colonel's death was no accident, she was certain. His talk of a murderer's photograph, the nervous staff, the botanist's guarded demeanor, all threads in a tapestry she would unravel. For now, she had evidence, however small, and a witness in Lila, however frightened. The night was warm, but a chill ran through her, not from the air but from the certainty that St. Lucian's paradise hid a poisoner's heart. As she sipped a fresh cup of tea, Miss Marple resolved to watch and listen, as she always did. The island's secrets would not stay hidden for long. She smiled faintly, her needles resuming their rhythm. The game, as her old friend Sir Henry Clithering might say, was afoot. The narrative continued, weaving through the vibrant tapestry of St. Lucian's golden coconut resort, where every palm frond and cocktail glass seemed to whisper secrets. Miss Marple, with her unassuming demeanor and razor-sharp mind, navigated the social currents with the ease of a seasoned sailor. The colonel's death had cast a shadow, but the resort's rhythm, its laughter, its clinking glasses, its steel drums carried on, as if determined to drown out the tragedy. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her body protesting the tropical heat but her mind as crisp as a St. Mary Mead dawn. She donned a light cotton dress, her straw hat firmly in place, and set out to explore the resort's grounds. The crushed shell paths wound through gardens bursting with hibiscus and frangipani, their colors so vivid they seemed to hum. She passed the pool, where Margot Steele lounged under a parasol, her sunglasses shielding her thoughts. The actress's beauty was undeniable: golden hair, porcelain skin, a figure sculpted for the silver screen, but her fingers tapped restlessly, betraying an inner turmoil. Miss Marple paused by a cluster of orchids, where Dr. Clara Vines was examining a plant with a magnifying glass. The botanist's cocky attire was practical, almost severe, but her scarf of vibrant green silk hinted at a hidden flair. Beautiful, aren't they? Miss Marple ventured, her tone conversational. Dr. Vines started, her magnifying glass slipping. Oh yes, she replied, her voice clipped. Epidendrum nocturnum. They bloom only at night. Her eyes narrowed, as if assessing whether Miss Marple's interest was genuine or probing. They must have stories to tell, Miss Marple said lightly, her smile disarming. Plants are such quiet witnesses, don't you think? Dr. Vine's lips twitched, but she said nothing. Returning to her work, Miss Marple filed the moment away, noting the botanist's guardedness. A woman who studies night-blooming orchids, she thought, might also cultivate darker secrets. At breakfast, served on a terrace overlooking the lagoon, Miss Marple chose a table near the edge, where she could observe without being conspicuous. The guests trickled in, their faces a mix of holiday cheer and unease. The Colonel's death was the unspoken guest at every table, though Mr. Carver's assurances of a natural passing had quelled open panic. Miss Marple sipped her grapefruit juice, her eyes scanning the crowd. A young couple, honeymooners by their glowing smiles, chatted animatedly. A businessman, his suit incongruous in the tropical heat, read a newspaper with studied indifference. And then there was Leela, serving coffee with a forced smile, her eyes darting to Miss Marple as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple beckoned her over, pretending to need more sugar. "Leela, dear," she murmured. "That man you saw yesterday, can you describe him?" Leela glanced around, her voice barely a whisper. "Tall, dark hair, a scar on his cheek. He wore a worker's uniform, but it didn't fit right. Too loose, like he borrowed it." Miss Marple nodded, patting the girl's hand. "You've done well to notice. Keep your eyes open, but don't put yourself in danger." Lila's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded before hurrying away. The morning passed in a haze of sun and suspicion. Miss Marple strolled the beach, her sensible shoes sinking slightly in the sand. She paused by a rocky outcrop, where the tide had left a tangle of seaweed and shells. Something glinted among the debris, a metal button, engraved with a tiny anchor. It was out of place, too polished for flotsam. She tucked it into her handkerchief, alongside the glass shard, her mind turning over possibilities. A button from a uniform. Perhaps. Lila's mysterious stranger came to mind. Back at the resort, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Du Bois, the elderly gardener she'd glimpsed pruning roses near her bungalow. He was a weary man with skin like weathered teak, his eyes bright with the wisdom of years. "Good morning, Mr. Du Bois," she said, pausing by his rose bushes. "These are lovely. Do you tend all the gardens here?" He grinned, revealing a gap-toothed smile. "Most of 'em, ma'am. Been here 40 years. These roses, they're my pride." His hands, gnarled but steady, snipped a wilted bloom with precision. They fell into easy conversation. Miss Marple's questions gentle but pointed. She learned that the resort had changed hands recently, its new owners pouring money into renovations but skimping on staff wages. "Folks are tense," Mr. Du Bois admitted, his voice low. "And that colonel always poking his nose where it wasn't wanted. Talked about some old case, said he had proof." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to hum with anticipation. "Proof?" she prompted. "A photograph," Mr. Du Bois said, his eyes narrowing. "Said it showed a killer he met years ago. Kept it close, like a talisman." He shook his head. "And now he's gone. Heart attack, they say." But he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the hills, where the old plantation loomed, half hidden by mist. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. A photograph, a killer, a poisoner's scent in a broken glass. The pieces were scattered, but she was adept at puzzles. She returned to her bungalow, where she examined the glass shard under the light of a small lamp. The bitter almond scent was faint but unmistakable, and the shard's edge bore a trace of residue, sticky to the touch. She wrapped it carefully, knowing it would need proper analysis, though on an island like St. Lucian, such resources were scarce. Lunch brought another opportunity to observe. Margot Steele joined the businessman at a shaded table, their conversation hushed but intense. Miss Marple, seated nearby with a plate of grilled prawns, caught snippets, something about a contract, a scandal, a need to keep it quiet. Margaret's laugh was brittle, her hand brushing the businessman's arm with calculated charm. Dr. Vines, meanwhile, ate alone, her notebook open but untouched, her eyes fixed on Margot with an intensity that bordered on predatory. As the meal ended, Miss Marple approached Leela, who was clearing tables. "My dear," she said softly, "I wonder if you might keep an eye on our friend Dr. Vines. Nothing obvious, just notice where she goes." Leela nodded, her fear tempered by resolve. "I will, Miss Marple. I trust you." The words warmed Miss Marple's heart, reminding her of the many young women she'd guided in St. Mary Mead, girls like Leela, caught in webs not of their making. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and Miss Marple retreated to her veranda, her knitting a pretext for thought. The Colonel's death was the key, she decided. His photograph, his stories, his sudden collapse, they pointed to a secret someone was desperate to bury. The bitter almond scent suggested cyanide, but the residue on the glass hinted at something more complex, perhaps a plant-based toxin. Dr. Vine's expertise loomed large, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. People, she'd learned, were rarely what they seemed. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the lagoon in shades of coral and gold, Miss Marple made her way to the bar, where the evening's festivities were beginning. The steel drums were silent now, replaced by a guitarist strumming a mournful tune. The guests mingled, their laughter tinged with unease. Miss Marple ordered a lemonade, her eyes scanning the crowd. Margot Steele was absent, as was Dr. Vines. The businessman, however, was deep in conversation with Mr. Carver, their heads bent close. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the bar. A young waiter had dropped a tray, the crash of glass echoing the Colonel's fatal fall. The guests flinched, their nerves raw. Miss Marple caught Lila's eye across the room, and the girl gave a subtle nod, as if to say she'd seen something. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her mind as clear as the lagoon's waters. The Colonel's death was no isolated tragedy, it was the opening move in a deadly game. She slipped away from the bar, her steps light despite her age. At her bungalow, she retrieved the glass shard and the anchor button, laying them on her desk like pieces of a chessboard. The night was young, and St. Lucian's secrets were just beginning to unravel. She would watch, she would listen, and she would wait. The poisoner, whoever they were, had made their first mistake, and Miss Jane Marple never let a mistake go unpunished. Chapter 2. Whispers of the past. The sun hung low over St. Lucian, casting a golden sheen across the turquoise waves that lapped at the Golden Coconut Resort's pristine beach. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted to shield her eyes, sat on a wicker chair beneath a palm tree, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the rhythm of the resort. The air was thick with the scent of hibiscus and salt, but beneath the tropical allure, a faint unease stirred in her sharp mind. The Colonel's collapse the previous evening, dismissed by the resort doctor as a heart attack, lingered in her thoughts. That bitter almond scent in his glass, distinct, too deliberate, hinted at something far more sinister than a natural death. She had pocketed a shard of the shattered glass, now tucked safely in her handbag, its jagged edge a silent promise to uncover the truth. Her nephew Raymond would have chuckled at her suspicion, calling it her village instinct at work. But Miss Marple knew better. People were the same everywhere, whether in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead or the sun-soaked shores of this Caribbean hideaway. Greed, fear, and secrets wove the same tangled webs, and she was determined to unravel this one. Her gaze drifted to the resort's sprawling gardens, where an elderly man in a faded linen shirt knelt among a riot of orchids and bougainvillea. His hands, gnarled as mangrove roots, worked with a tenderness that belied his weathered frame. This was Mr. Du Bois, the gardener she'd noticed earlier. his quiet presence a contrast to the flamboyant guests. Miss Marple folded her knitting, slipped it into her basket, and rose, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path as she approached him. "Good morning, Mr. Du Bois," she said, her voice warm but laced with that gentle curiosity that disarmed even the wariest souls. "Your gardens are quite the marvel. I've never seen such vibrant colors." Mr. Du Bois looked up, his dark eyes crinkling beneath a straw hat. "Thank you, Mum. These blooms, they tell stories if you know how to listen." His accent carried the lilt of the islands, rich and unhurried, like the tide. "Stories?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile encouraging. "I'm rather fond of those." "What tales do these flowers tell?" he chuckled, brushing soil from his hands. "Oh, they speak of time, of secrets buried deep. St. Lucian's got a past that don't stay quiet." He gestured to a cluster of crimson hibiscus. "These here, they grow where the old estate used to be. Folks say it was cursed. That place burned down 50 years ago. But the earth remembers." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained placid. "Cursed? That sounds intriguing. Was there a particular misfortune tied to it?" Mr. Du Bois hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the resort's main building, where staff bustled with trays of iced drinks. He lowered his voice. "They called her La Sorcière the Witch. A woman lived there, long ago. Mixed potions, some say poisons, from the plants round here. Helped folks with ailments. But some swore she cursed those who crossed her. One day, she vanished. Some say she died in the fire, others say she slipped into the shadows. Either way, her name's still whispered when things go wrong." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her handbag. "Poisons," the word echoed in her mind, conjuring the faint almond scent from the Colonel's glass. "Fascinating," she murmured. "And do people still believe in such curses?" "Some do," Mr. Du Bois said, his tone cautious. "Especially when folks die sudden like that Colonel last night. Heart attack, they say. But," he trailed off, his eyes darting to the side as if wary of being overheard. Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice soft. "You don't think it was a heart attack, do you, Mr. Du Bois?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, he shook his head. "I ain't one for gossip, Mum, but I've seen too many seasons on this island. Things ain't always what they seem." Their conversation was interrupted by a young maid hurrying down the path, her apron slightly askew, her name tag read, Leela, and her dark curls bounced as she approached, her face flushed with nervous energy. "Mr. Du Bois, they need you at the kitchen garden. Something about the herbs for tonight's dinner." Mr. Du Bois nodded, rising slowly. "Duty calls, Miss Marple," she supplied, smiling. "Jane Marple." He tipped his hat. "Pleasure. Miss Marple, you watch yourself round here. Some stories got thorns." With that, he ambled off, leaving Miss Marple alone with Leela. The maid lingered, twisting her hands. Miss Marple noted the girl's unease, the way her eyes darted toward the bungalows where the guests stayed. "Is something troubling you, Leela?" she asked gently. Leela bit her lip, glancing around before speaking in a hushed tone. "It's just, I saw something last night, before the Colonel. You know, there was a stranger near his bungalow. Not a guest, not staff, just a shadow, moving quick-like. I didn't say nothing to the manager, he'd think I was making it up." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. "A shadow, you say? Did you see anything distinct about them?" "A hat, perhaps," or the way they moved. Leela shook her head. It was dark, and I was cleaning the patio. But they were tall, I think, and sneaky, like they didn't want to be seen. I told myself it was nothing, but after what happened, her voice trembled, and she looked down. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on Lila's arm. You were right to tell me, my dear. It's often the smallest details that matter most. Would you be willing to keep an eye out for anything else unusual? Discreetly, of course. Lila's eyes widened, but she nodded, a spark of resolve flickering in her expression. I can do that, Miss Marple. I don't want nobody else getting hurt. You're a brave girl, Leela, Miss Marple said, her tone warm. And don't worry, I'll be here to help. As Leela hurried back to her duties, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind buzzing. A poisoner from the island's past, a mysterious stranger, and the Colonel's death, all threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to weave. The Colonel had been boasting about a photograph, she recalled, one tied to a murderer he'd met years ago. She'd overheard him at the welcome reception, his voice loud with rum and bravado, waving a faded Polaroid before tucking it away. Now, that photograph was missing from his room. According to the staff she'd discreetly questioned that morning, she decided to investigate further. The Colonel's bungalow was cordoned off, but Miss Marple had a knack for slipping past such barriers. She waited until the afternoon heat drove most guests to their air-conditioned rooms, then made her way to the row of bungalows nestled among palm trees. The Colonel's, number 12, stood at the end, its shutters closed, a faint police tape fluttering in the breeze. The lock was simple, and Miss Marple, with a hairpin and a lifetime of quiet ingenuity, was inside within moments. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and coconuts and screen. The Colonel's belongings scattered as if he'd expected to return. His suitcase lay open on the bed, shirts neatly folded, but his desk was a mess of papers and empty rum bottles. She sifted through them carefully. Her gloved hands were upon gloves, even in the tropics. For one never knew when fingerprints might matter, finding nothing of note, until she lifted a leather-bound journal. The journal was worn, its pages yellowed, filled with the Colonel's cramped handwriting. She skimmed entries about his military days, his travels, and then paused at a passage dated the day before his death. Saw a face from the past today. Couldn't believe it. That case in '68, the one that got away. The photograph's proof. But I'll keep it close. Can't trust anyone here. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The photograph again. She searched the desk, the suitcase, even the pockets of the Colonel's garish Hawaiian shirts, but found nothing. The photograph was gone, likely taken by the shadow Leela had seen. She tucked the journal under her arm, intending to study it later, and was about to leave when she heard footsteps outside. She froze, her heart steady despite the danger. The footsteps paused, then moved away, but not before she glimpsed a tall figure through the slatted shutters. A man, perhaps, in a dark jacket, unusual for the tropical heat. She waited, counting to 60, before slipping out and locking the door behind her. Back in her own bungalow, Miss Marple sat at the small writing desk, the journal open before her. The Colonel's words hinted at a connection to a past crime, one significant enough to haunt him decades later. She recalled his boastful tale at the cocktail party, how he'd claimed to have stared into the eyes of a killer during a case in his younger days. The photograph, she suspected, held the key to that killer's identity and perhaps the motive for his murder. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Leela, her face pale. "Miss Marple, I found something," she whispered, Glancing over her shoulder, she held out a small, crumpled note, its edges frayed as if torn from a larger sheet. It was in the trash by the main lounge. I thought it might mean something. Miss Marple took the note, her eyes scanning the scrawled words. Keep quiet, or you'll end up like him. No signature, no names. But the threat was clear. She looked at Leela, who was trembling slightly. You've done well, my dear, she said. This is important. Can you tell me exactly where you found it? Near the bar. In a bin by the patio, Leela said. I was emptying it when I saw it. I didn't touch anything else. I swear. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The note suggested someone else was being warned. Perhaps another guest who knew too much. Leela, you mustn't tell anyone about this, not yet. But keep watching, and come to me if you see that stranger again. Can you do that? Leela nodded, her jaw set. I can, Miss Marple. I want to help. As Leela left, Miss Marple tucked the note into her handbag alongside the glass shard. The pieces were coming together, slowly but surely. The Colonel's death was no accident, and the photograph was the key. Someone at the resort, perhaps the tall stranger. Perhaps another guest had a secret worth killing for. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and unassuming charm, was determined to uncover it. The afternoon waned, and Miss Marple decided to join the other guests for tea on the veranda, a perfect vantage point to observe their interactions. The glamorous actress, Margot Steele, held court at one table, her laughter bright but brittle, while the botanist, Dr. Clara Vines, sat alone, her eyes fixed on a notebook. The businessman, Mr. Harrow, chatted with the quiet widow, his wife, their conversation polite but strained. Miss Marple noted every glance, every pause, her mind cataloging the subtle signs of guilt or fear. As she sipped her tea, she overheard Margot mention the Colonel's photograph to her manager, Victor, in a hushed tone. He was waving it around. Like a trophy, Margot said, her voice sharp. If it's gone, someone took it. And I don't like what that means. Victor's response was too low to hear, but his posture tense, almost predatory, caught Miss Marple's attention. She made a mental note to watch him closely. The photograph, the note, the stranger in the shadows all pointed to a web of secrets, and Miss Marple was at its center, her knitting needles clicking as she wove her own trap. The evening brought a soft breeze, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant rhythm of steel drums. Miss Marple returned to her bungalow, the journal and note laid out before her. She began to read the Colonel's entries in earnest, her eyes catching on a name, Eleanor Vane. The Colonel had written it with a trembling hand, followed by a single word, Murdress. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind racing. Eleanor Vane. The name was unfamiliar, but the Colonel's fear was palpable. Was she the poisoner from St. Lucian's past, La Sorcière? Or was she someone else, someone hiding among the guests? The photograph, she was certain, held the answer. And Leela, brave little Leela, was her ally in finding it. As the moon rose over the island, casting silver light through her window, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill. The game was afoot, and though the tropical paradise glittered with beauty, its shadows hid a killer. She would find them, as she always did, with patience, perception, and a touch of village wisdom. Chapter 3. The botanist's secret sun dipped low over St. Lucian, painting the sky in hues of mango and coral, as the golden coconut resort buzzed with the clink of glasses and the hum of conversation. The open-air dining pavilion, draped in flowering vines and lit by flickering lanterns, was alive with the evening's promise, a lavish dinner meant to showcase the island's bounty. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a corner table with a view of the entire scene, adjusted her shawl and sipped her lime cordial, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The guests, a kaleidoscope of personalities, laughed and chatted, their voices blending with the distant crash of waves. Yet beneath the surface gaiety, Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, like a shadow flitting beneath the water's surface. Her attention settled on Dr. Clara Vines, the botanist, who sat alone at a table near the edge of the pavilion. Dr. Vines was a striking woman in her late 40s, with a cascade of dark hair streaked with silver and a demeanor that suggested both intellect and secrecy. Her fingers toyed with a small leather satchel on her lap, and her eyes darted occasionally to the other guests, as if measuring them. Miss Marple had noticed her earlier that day, kneeling in the resort's lush gardens, examining a peculiar plant with leaves that curled like tiny fists. The botanist's expertise in tropical flora had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity, particularly after Mr. Du Bois, the elderly gardener, had mentioned the island's history of toxic plants used in old rituals. The dinner began with a flourish. Platters of grilled snapper, bowls of mango salsa, and trays of roasted breadfruit circulated among the tables. The glamorous actress, Margot Steele, held court at the center of the pavilion, her laughter ringing out like a bell as she regaled her admirers with tales of her latest film. Her manager, Victor, hovered nearby, his slick smile never quite reaching his eyes. The wealthy businessman, Mr. Harold Grayson, sat with his wife, a quiet woman who seemed more interested in her wine than the conversation. The other guests, a retired professor, a young couple on their honeymoon, and a dour widow named Mrs. Harrow, added their own flavors to the evening's mix. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Dr. Vines as the botanist excused herself from her table, her satchel clutched tightly. She moved toward the buffet, where a server was pouring drinks from a crystal decanter. Miss Marple noted the way Dr. Vines lingered near the decanter, her hand slipping into her satchel for a moment before withdrawing. It was a subtle gesture, but to Miss Marple, it was as loud as a shout. She recalled the bitter almond scent in the Colonel's glass the previous night, a hallmark of cyanide. Though the official report had dismissed it as a heart attack, could Dr. Vines, with her knowledge of toxic plants, be involved? As the meal progressed, Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. She watched Dr. Vines return to her seat, only to be approached by Margot Steele, who leaned in close, her expression sharp. Their exchange was brief but heated, words clipped and gestures tense. Margot's hand grazed Dr. Vines' arm, and the botanist flinched, her satchel slipping slightly from her lap. Miss Marple strained to hear, but the din of the pavilion swallowed their words. When Margot stormed off, Dr. Vines' face was pale, her fingers tightening around the satchel's strap. The evening took a turn when Mr. Grayson, the businessman, stood abruptly, his face flushed. "This wine tastes off," he grumbled, setting his glass down with a clatter. His wife, startled, reached for him as he swayed, clutching the table for support. "Just dizzy," he muttered, waving off a concerned server. The other guests murmured, their attention drawn to the scene. Miss Marple's mind raced. Dizziness could be a symptom of many things: heat, alcohol, or something more sinister. She glanced at Dr. Vines, who was watching Mr. Grayson with an unreadable expression. Excusing herself, Miss Marple rose and approached the buffet, her movements slow and deliberate, as if merely stretching her legs. She lingered near Mr. Grayson's table, where his half-empty glass sat unattended. With a deftness that belied her age, She swapped his glass with a clean one from a nearby tray, ensuring no one noticed. The action was instinctive, born of a nagging suspicion that the businessman's sudden ailment was no coincidence. She returned to her seat, her heart quickening as she tucked the suspect glass into her handbag. Hidden beneath her shawl, the dinner resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests whispered about Mr. Grayson's episode, and the staff bustled to clear plates and refill drinks. Miss Marple watched Dr. Vines, who had retreated to a corner of the pavilion, her satchel now open on the table. From her vantage point, Miss Marple glimpsed a small glass vial inside, its contents catching the lantern light with a faint shimmer. The botanist quickly closed the satchel, but not before Miss Marple noted the label, a handwritten scrawl she couldn't decipher from this distance. As the evening wound down, Miss Marple struck up a conversation with Mr. Du Bois, who had joined the staff to help clear the tables. "Such a lovely dinner," she said, her tone light. "Though I wonder about the plants used in the kitchen. Are they all safe, Mr. Du Bois?" The gardener's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Most are, Miss Marple, but the island's got its secrets. Take the manchineel tree, its sap burns the skin, and its fruit can kill. Or the oleander, pretty as a picture but deadly in a brew. Dr. Vines knows 'em all. She's been studying our plants for weeks. Says they're for her research." "Research?" Miss Marple tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "What sort, I wonder?" Mr. Du Bois shrugged. "Something about medicinal compounds. But she's cagey about it. Keeps to herself, mostly, down in that greenhouse of hers." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the information. She excused herself and took a leisurely stroll toward the resort's gardens, where the greenhouse stood, its glass walls glowing faintly under the moonlight. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and damp earth, and the distant rhythm of steel drums drifted from the pavilion. She approached the greenhouse cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the soft grass. The door was unlocked, a careless oversight. Inside, the air was humid, thick with the earthy smell of soil and the sharp tang of greenery. Rows of plants lined the shelves, orchids, ferns, and stranger specimens with spiky leaves and vibrant blooms. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a workbench cluttered with vials, notebooks, and a mortar and pestle stained with green residue. A small label on one vial caught her attention. Nerium oleander extract. She recalled Mr. Du Bois' words about oleander's toxicity. Could this be the source of the poison? A rustle behind her made her turn. Dr. Vines stood in the doorway, her satchel slung over her shoulder. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice calm but edged with suspicion. "What brings you here so late?" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone airy. "I couldn't resist a peek at your beautiful plants. Such fascinating work you do. I was just admiring." "What is this?" She gestured vaguely at the workbench, her eyes locking onto Dr. Vines. The botanist hesitated, then stepped forward, her expression softening. "Just my research. Tropical plants have remarkable properties. Some heal, some harm. I'm studying their potential." "Fascinating," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "Though one must be careful, I imagine. Some plants can be quite dangerous." Dr. Vine's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "Indeed. That's why I keep my work secure." She patted her satchel, a gesture Miss Marple noted with interest. As they left the greenhouse, Miss Marple's mind churned. The vial in Dr. Vine's satchel, the oleander extract, Mr. Grayson's dizziness, it all pointed to a pattern, one she couldn't yet fully grasp. But she was certain of one thing. The botanist was hiding something, and it was tied to the Colonel's death. She resolved to keep a closer eye on Dr. Vines, knowing that the truth, like the island's deadly plants, lay hidden in plain sight. The night deepened, and Miss Marple returned to her bungalow, the suspect glass still tucked safely in her handbag. She sat by her window, the sea whispering secrets beyond the shore, and began to piece together the puzzle. The colonel's death, the botanist's vial, Margaret's argument, it was all connected, she was sure. And as the stars glittered above St. Lucian, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase, her resolve as sharp as ever. The next morning, the resort awoke to a gentle breeze and the chatter of parrots in the palm trees. Miss Marple, refreshed after a few hours' sleep, joined the guests for breakfast on the terrace. Mr. Grayson, looking pale but recovered, was back at his wife's side, dismissing his episode as too much sun. Miss Marple smiled politely, her thoughts elsewhere. She needed to confirm her suspicions about the glass and the vial, but she also needed allies. She found Leela, the young maid, clearing dishes near the buffet. "Good morning, Leela," Miss Marple said softly, her voice warm. "You've been so helpful with the guests. I wonder if you might keep an eye on Dr. Vines for me. Nothing intrusive, just notice where she goes, what she does." Lila's eyes widened, but she nodded, emboldened by Miss Marple's trust. "I can do that, ma'am. She's been in the greenhouse a lot, and yesterday I saw her with a little bottle, like the one you asked about." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A bottle? Where?" "In her bag. During dinner. She kept touching it, like she was nervous." "Thank you, Leela," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. "You're doing splendidly." As Leela returned to her duties, Miss Marple turned her attention to the other guests. Margot Steele was absent, likely sleeping off the previous night's revelry, but Victor was present, his eyes scanning the terrace like a hawk. Miss Marple noted his restlessness, the way his fingers drummed on the table. Was he watching Dr. Vines, too? Or was he guarding his own secrets? The day unfolded, with the lazy rhythm of a tropical holiday. Guests lounged by the pool, swam in the turquoise sea, or wandered the resort's trails. Miss Marple, however, was far from idle. She spent the morning in her bungalow, examining the glass she'd taken from Mr. Grayson's table. In the daylight, she noticed a faint residue inside, a powdery film that confirmed her fears. She wrapped the glass carefully in a handkerchief and tucked it into her suitcase, determined to find a way to test it. By afternoon, she ventured back to the gardens, where Mr. Du Bois was pruning a hibiscus bush. "Mr. Du Bois," she called, her tone cheerful, "might you tell me more about Dr. Vines' work? She seems so dedicated." The gardener wiped his brow, his expression thoughtful. "She's a clever one, that's for sure. Been studying our plants like they're her children. Says she's writing a book on their uses medicine, mostly. But I've seen her with some odd ones, like the nightshade and the castor bean. Not exactly healing plants, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Nightshade and castor beans were notorious for their toxicity. Ricin from the latter was particularly deadly. "Does she work alone?" she asked. "Mostly," Mr. Du Bois replied, "though I saw her with that manager, Victor, a few days ago. Looked like they were arguing about something. He was waving a piece of paper, all red in the face." Miss Marple thanked him and wandered toward the greenhouse again, her thoughts swirling. Victor and Dr. Vines, arguing over a paper. Could it be related to the colonel's photograph? Or something else entirely? She needed more information, but the pieces were beginning to fit. That evening, the resort hosted a cocktail hour on the beach, the sand aglow with tiki torches. Miss Marple, dressed in a simple linen frock, mingled with the guests, her ears attuned to every snippet of conversation. She overheard Margot complaining to a friend about Victor's controlling ways, her voice sharp with frustration. "He thinks he owns me," she said, tossing her hair. "If he wasn't so good at his job, I'd be rid of him." Miss Marple filed the comment away, her attention shifting to Dr. Vines, who stood apart from the crowd, sipping a drink and watching the waves. The botanist's satchel was absent tonight, a detail Miss Marple found curious. Had she hidden the vial elsewhere, or was she confident her work was done? As the night wore on, Miss Marple approached Dr. Vines, her demeanor friendly but probing. "Dr. Vines, I must say, your work sounds fascinating. Have you found anything particularly potent in your studies?" The botanist's smile was tight. "Oh, the island's full of surprises. Some plants could cure a fever, others could stop a heart. It's all about knowing how to use them. And you're careful, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "One wouldn't want such knowledge in the wrong hands." Dr. Vine's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, my research is purely academic." Miss Marple nodded, letting the conversation drift to lighter topics. But as she excused herself, she felt a chill despite the warm night air. Dr. Vines was hiding something, and the vial in her satchel was the key. Miss Marple resolved to act quickly, knowing that another guest could be in danger by the next morning. Mr. Grayson was back to his boisterous self, laughing off his dizziness as a bad batch of wine. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily convinced. She enlisted Lilla's help to keep watch on Dr. Vine's bungalow, hoping to catch her with the vial again. Meanwhile, she planned to speak with Margot, sensing the actress's tension with Victor might hold a clue. As she walked along the beach, the waves lapping at her feet, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing on her. The Colonel's death, the botanist's secrets, the businessman's near miss. It was a web of deceit, and she was determined to untangle it. With the glass safely hidden and Lilla's eyes on Dr. Vines, Miss Marple knew she was one step closer to the truth. The island's paradise might hide its dangers, but Jane Marple was no stranger to uncovering shadows in the sun. Chapter 4. Moonlit motif. The Caribbean moon hung low over St. Lucian, casting a silver sheen across the golden coconut resort. Its light danced on the waves, lapping gently against the shore, while the air carried the heady scent of hibiscus and salt. Miss Jane Marple sat on her bungalow's veranda, her knitting needles clicking softly, a shawl draped over her shoulders despite the warm night. The resort's festive chatter had faded, replaced by the hum of cicadas and the distant strum of a guitar. Yet, beneath this tranquil veneer, Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, sharp as the glint of a hidden blade. She had retired early from the evening's cocktail hour, claiming fatigue, but her mind was alight with observations. The glamorous actress, Margot Steele, had been unusually tense, her laughter brittle as she deflected questions about her latest film. Her manager, Victor, had hovered too closely, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Dr. Clara Vines, the botanist, had excused herself abruptly after dinner, clutching her bag as if it held a secret she feared would slip free. And then, there was the Colonel's death, officially a heart attack. But Miss Marple's discovery of the bitter almond scent in his glass suggested otherwise. Cyanide, perhaps, or something more exotic, suited to this tropical isle. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, heated exchange drifting from the garden path below. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and leaned forward, her ears attuned to the voices. It was Margot, her tone low but fierce, and Victor, his responses clipped and defensive. "You promised it was handled, Victor," Margot hissed, her voice carrying the weight of desperation. "If that photograph gets out, I'm finished. You know what it means to me. Keep your voice down." Victor snapped. "It's under control. No one's seen it, and no one will. Just stick to the plan." Margot, Miss Marple's fingers, tightened around her knitting needles. A photograph, likely the same one the Colonel had boasted about, the one missing from his room. A clue to his death, perhaps, or something deeper, tying the guests to a shared, shadowy past. She made a mental note to probe further, but before she could eavesdrop more, the voices faded as Margot and Victor moved out of earshot, their silhouettes swallowed by the moonlit palms. Rising quietly, Miss Marple slipped into her sensible shoes and donned a light cardigan. A stroll under the stars might clear her mind and offer a chance to observe the resort's nocturnal secrets. She stepped onto the path, her small figure blending into the shadows, her steps soft against the crushed coral. The resort sprawled before her, its bungalows glowing faintly with lamplight, their occupants unaware of the watchful spinster weaving through their midst. As she neared the beach, a new sound caught her attention, a low, rhythmic melody, played on a guitar. Following it, she found Javier, the local musician, seated on a driftwood log by the shore. His fingers coaxed a haunting tune from the strings, the notes weaving through the night like a siren's call. He was young, with dark eyes that sparkled with mischief, his shirt unbuttoned to catch the breeze. Miss Marple approached, her presence unnoticed until she spoke. "A lovely tune, Mr. Javier," she said, her voice gentle but deliberate. "It suits the night, though it carries a certain melancholy, don't you think?" Javier started, his fingers pausing on the strings. He flashed a disarming smile, recovering quickly. "Miss Marple, you move like a ghost. Didn't expect company out here." He strummed a lighter chord, as if to dispel the mood. "Just playing to the moon." "She's a good listener." Miss Marple settled onto a nearby bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "The moon hears many secrets, I imagine. This island has its share, doesn't it? Old stories, perhaps, of things best forgotten." Javier's smile faltered, just for a moment. "You've been talking to old Du Bois, haven't you? He loves his ghost stories. Says the island's cursed, that the plants themselves can kill if you're not careful." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ever hear of the devil's breath? Grows wild out by the cliffs. One whiff, and you're not yourself anymore. Makes you do things, or forget what you've done." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained placid. "How fascinating. A plant that steals one's will? That sounds like something a botanist might study, someone like Dr. Vines." "Perhaps," Javier chuckled, "but there was an edge to it. Clara? She's always poking around in the dirt, collecting leaves and muttering about alkaloids. Bit strange, if you ask me. But she's harmless. Just likes her plants more than people. An understandable preference. At times," Miss Marple said, her tone light but probing. "Though I wonder if some plants might be more dangerous than others. Have you ever seen anything unusual around the resort? Near the bungalows, perhaps?" Javier's fingers stilled on the guitar, and he glanced toward the resort, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You're sharp, aren't you, Miss Marple? All right, I'll tell you something. "A few nights back, before the Colonel. Well, you know, I saw someone skulking near his bungalow. Couldn't make out who, but they were moving fast, like they didn't want to be seen. Thought it was just a guest sneaking around for a late-night rendezvous. But now," he shrugged, leaving the thought unfinished. Miss Marple nodded, storing the detail away. "Most interesting. And you've seen nothing since?" "No one else wandering where they shouldn't." Javier hesitated, then shook his head. "Not that I've noticed, but I'll keep my eyes open. This place, it's paradise, sure. But paradise has shadows, you know." Before Miss Marple could respond, a piercing scream shattered the night, slicing through the gentle lapping of the waves. Javier leapt to his feet, guitar forgotten, as Miss Marple rose with surprising agility for her age. The scream had come from the direction of the resort's main building, near the staff quarters. Without a word, they hurried toward the sound, Javier leading the way with his long strides, Miss Marple following at a brisk pace, her mind racing. They reached the staff area, a cluster of modest cabins tucked behind the kitchens. A small crowd had gathered, their faces pale in the moonlight. At the center stood Leela, the young maid, her hands trembling as she pointed to a cleaning cart parked beside her cabin. A slender, feathered dart protruded from a folded towel, its tip glinting ominously. "Don't touch it," Miss Marple called out, her voice firm despite its softness. The staff froze, their eyes turning to the elderly woman who seemed, inexplicably, to command the scene. She approached the cart, her steps measured, and examined the dart without touching it. Its shaft was carved from a dark wood, adorned with tiny red feathers, and its tip bore a faint, sticky residue. Poison, she thought, her heart quickening. Not cyanide this time, but something else, something tied to Javier's tales of cursed plants. "Leela, my dear," Miss Marple said, turning to the shaken maid, "can you tell me exactly what happened? Every detail, if you please." Lila's eyes were wide, her voice trembling but steadied by Miss Marple's calm presence. I was finishing my rounds, putting the cart away for the night. I reached for the towels, and there it was, just stuck there. I didn't see anyone, Miss Marple. I swear, but I felt like someone was watching me, like they'd been waiting for me to find it." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on Lila's arm. "You've done very well to tell me, Leela. Now, stay close, and don't touch that dart. We'll need to keep it safe, it's evidence, you see." She turned to Javier, who was watching the scene with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Mr. Javier, would you be so kind as to fetch Mr. Du Bois? He may know something about this dart, given his knowledge of the island." Javier nodded and sprinted off, while Miss Marple instructed a nearby staff member to guard the cart, ensuring no one tampered with it. She knelt beside Leela, her voice low and soothing. "You're safe now, my dear. I promise you, I'll get to the bottom of this. But you must be brave for me. Yes, keep your eyes and ears open, just as you did for the Colonel." Leela nodded, her fear easing under Miss Marple's steady gaze. "I will, Miss Marple. I trust you." As the crowd dispersed, whispering among themselves, Miss Marple carefully extracted the dart using a handkerchief, wrapping it securely before slipping it into her pocket. The moonlight revealed a faint symbol etched into the dart's shaft, a spiral, like a coiled snake. It was unfamiliar, yet it stirred a memory of something Mr. Du Bois had mentioned, an old island legend about a poisoner who marked their weapons with a serpent's sign. Mr. Du Bois arrived, breathless, with Javier at his side. The elderly gardener's weathered face creased with worry. as he examined the dart in Miss Marple's handkerchief. "This is bad, miss," he said, his voice low. "This mark gets from the old stories. The serpent's kiss, they called it. A poisoner used darts like this, long ago, to settle scores. They'd dip in sap from the devil's breath. Or worse. Whoever left this meant harm." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "Then we must find out who, Mr. Du Bois, and why they chose Lilla's cart. Someone is sending a message or covering their tracks." She turned to Javier, who was lingering nearby, his expression unreadable. "And you, Mr. Javier, must be careful. If you saw someone near the Colonel's bungalow, you may be a target yourself." Javier's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I can handle myself, Miss Marple, but I'll watch my back and yours, if you need it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Very kind of you, I'm sure. Now, let's return to our beds. Tomorrow will bring new clues." "I have no doubt." As she walked back to her bungalow, the dart safely tucked away, Miss Marple's mind churned. The photograph, the poison, the dart, all pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a killer among the resort's guests. Margaret's fear, Victor's secrecy, Dr. Vine's vials. And now this sinister dart suggested a web of motives, woven tightly. Under the tropical moon, someone was desperate to keep their past buried, and they were willing to kill to do so. Back in her room, Miss Marple placed the dart in a small tin, locking it in her suitcase. She sat by the window, gazing at the moonlit sea, her thoughts drifting to her village of St. Mary Mead. There, too, secrets had lurked beneath pleasant facades, and she had unraveled them all. St. Lucian was no different, she decided, just a prettier mask for human nature's darker impulses. She picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. Tomorrow, she would speak to Margot, probe Victor's story, and keep a closer eye on Dr. Vine's. The dart was a warning, but also a mistake, a tangible clue that could lead her to the truth. As the moon dipped lower, Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill. The game was afoot, and she was ready to play it to its satisfying end. The night stretched on, the resort cloaked in deceptive peace. But for Miss Jane Marple, sleep would wait. There were shadows to chase, and a poisoner to catch. In this island paradise. Chapter 5. The photograph's clothed tropical air of St. Lucian hung heavy with the promise of rain. A humid weight that pressed against Miss Jane Marple's linen shawl as she sat on the veranda of the Golden Coconut Resort. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant rumble of thunder over the Caribbean Sea. The resort, with its whitewashed bungalows and swaying palms, seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew secrets were unraveling beneath its sunlit façade. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, undimmed by age, flickered over the guests scattered across the dining area, their laughter and clinking glasses masking undercurrents of tension she could almost taste. She had persuaded Mr. Du Bois, the resort's elderly gardener, to search the late Colonel Hargreaves' belongings earlier that morning. The task had been delicate. Mr. Du Bois, with his weathered hands and gentle Creole lilt, was no stranger to discretion. But even he had hesitated at the thought of rifling through a dead man's things. Yet Miss Marple's quiet insistence, paired with a cup of chamomile tea and a story about her own garden in St. Mary Mead, had won him over. The result was a small, leather-bound diary, now tucked safely in her handbag, its pages filled with the Colonel's spidery handwriting. One entry, dated the day before his death, had caught her attention. A face from the past at the resort. Could it be him? The photograph confirms it. Must tread carefully. The photograph itself remained missing, a frustrating gap in the puzzle. Miss Marple's mind turned to the cryptic line in the diary. The face from the past. It suggested the colonel had recognized someone from a long-ago case, likely the murder he'd boasted about during his ill-fated cocktail hour. The question was who and why that recognition had cost him his life. The bitter almond scent in his glass, the shard she'd pocketed, and the nervous May Lilla's sighting of a stranger near his bungalow, all pointed to a deliberate act, not the heart attack the resort's doctor had hastily declared. A sudden gust of wind stirred the fronds above, scattering a few early raindrops. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and turned her attention to the guests. Dr. Clara Vines, the botanist, sat alone at a wicker table, her angular face buried in a notebook. Though her pen hadn't moved in minutes, her auburn hair, streaked with gray, was pulled into a severe bun, and her fingers twitched as if itching to reach for the small leather satchel at her side. Miss Marple had already noted the vial Dr. Vines had slipped into that bag during last night's dinner, a moment that coincided with the businessman Mr. Langley's sudden dizziness. The swap of his drinkware had been a precaution, one Miss Marple now felt justified in taking. Nearby, Margot Steele, the actress, held court with her manager, Victor Crane. Her laughter bright but brittle. Her platinum curls gleamed under the veranda's lanterns, and her emerald dress clung to her like a second skin, drawing every eye. Victor, lean and sharp-featured, hovered at her side, his smile tight, his gaze darting to the other guests as if measuring threats. Miss Marple had overheard their moonlit argument the previous night, words like scandal and photograph cutting through the humid air. Blackmail, she suspected, was at play, but whether Margot was victim or accomplice remained unclear. The other guests were a mixed lot. Mrs. Harrow, the quiet widow with a penchant for embroidery, sat in a corner, her needle pausing as she watched the room with hooded eyes. Javier, the local musician, strummed a guitar softly, his dark eyes lingering on Margot. And Mr. Langley, the businessman, now recovered, was deep in conversation with a resort staff member about chartering a yacht. Each, Miss Marple knew, could hold a piece of the puzzle or a motive. A clap of thunder broke her reverie, and the sky opened, rain sheeting down in a sudden, violent deluge. Guests scrambled for cover, their voices rising in a mix of laughter and complaints. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched by the spray, her mind racing. The storm, she thought, was a gift. It would trap everyone indoors, forcing interactions, revealing cracks in carefully maintained façades. She needed those cracks to widen. "Leela," she called softly as the young maid hurried past, balancing a tray of empty glasses. The girl, no older than 20, with wide brown eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her apron, paused. "Might you fetch me a pot of tea, dear? And perhaps a word in private?" Leela nodded, her gaze flickering toward the dining area where Dr. Vines was now packing away her notebook with quick, precise movements. "Yes, Miss Marple, I'll be right back." As Leela disappeared into the kitchen, Miss Marple opened the colonel's diary again, her fingers tracing the cryptic entry. "The face from the past. The photograph confirms it." Below it, in smaller script, was a phrase that had puzzled her since morning. 3 stars, 1 shadow. It felt like a code, a clue to the identity of the person the colonel had recognized. 3 stars could mean anything, 3 people, 3 events, 3 clues, but the shadow suggested something hidden, something dark. She needed more context, and the missing photograph was key. Leela returned with a steaming teapot and a single cup, setting them on the table with care. "Miss Marple," she whispered, leaning close. I found something odd when I cleaned Mr. Langley's room this morning. A note, tucked under his pillow. It wasn't there yesterday. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A note, you say? What did it say? Leela glanced over her shoulder, ensuring no one was near. It said, "Keep quiet, or you'll end like the Colonel." It was typed, no signature. I left it where it was. But it scared me. You did well to tell me, Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. Don't touch it again, Leela. We'll need it undisturbed. But keep your eyes open, dear. You're my best ally here. Leela flushed at the praise, her shoulders straightening. I will, Miss Marple. I promise. As Leela hurried off, Miss Marple poured her tea, the steam curling in the damp air. The note to Langley suggested the poisoner was growing bold or desperate. If Langley had been targeted last night, as she suspected, the poison had been weak, perhaps intentionally so, a warning rather than a killing blow. But why Langley? And how did it connect to the Colonel's death? The rain drummed on the roof, a steady roar that drowned out the chatter of the guests now crowded into the dining room. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning to the Colonel's diary. The 3 stars, one shadow phrase nagged at her. She flipped through the pages, searching for earlier entries that might shed light. Most were mundane notes on fishing spots, complaints about the heat, but one, dated a week prior, caught her eye. Dinner with V, S, and H. Old stories stirred memories. V's eyes were sharp. Too sharp. Does he know me? V, S, and H. Victor, Steele, and Harrow. Or perhaps Vines, Steele, and Harrow. The Colonel had dined with 3 people, one of whom might be the face from the past. The shadow, then, could be the secret they carried or the act of murder itself. Miss Marple closed the diary, her lips pursing. She needed to test this theory, and the storm provided the perfect opportunity. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and made her way to the dining room, where the guests were now seated at a long table, their faces lit by flickering lanterns. The power had flickered earlier, a common occurrence during St. Lucian's storms, and the staff had lit candles and lanterns to compensate. The effect was intimate, almost conspiratorial, and Miss Marple intended to use it. Such a dreadful storm, she said brightly, taking a seat near Mrs. Harrow. Reminds me of a night in St. Mary Mead when the vicarage flooded. We all gathered in the parlor, sharing stories to pass the time. Perhaps we could do the same. Margot Steele, her makeup flawless despite the humidity, clapped her hands. Oh, what a charming idea. Let's each tell a story, something thrilling. Victor, you start. Victor's smile was thin, his eyes narrowing. I'm no storyteller. Margot, you know that. Nonsense, Margot said, her voice teasing but edged. You've got plenty of tales. Tell us about that time you worked on that film in London, the one with the mysterious stranger. Victor's jaw tightened, but he leaned back, forcing a laugh. Fine. It was a gritty crime drama, set in the East End. I was a junior producer, barely out of my 20s. One night, a man showed up on set. Nobody knew him, but he had this presence. Said he was a consultant, but his eyes were cold, like he'd seen things. Later, we found out he'd been in prison for murder. The room went quiet, the rain's roar filling the silence. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. How fascinating, she said mildly. Did you ever learn his name? Victor hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. No. He vanished after a week. The director swore he'd never hired him. Dr. Vines, who had been silent, spoke up. Her voice clipped. Sounds like a ghost story. I prefer facts. Plants, for instance, don't lie. Did you know the manchineel tree, native to this island, can kill with a single drop of sap? Margot shivered theatrically. Clara, you're morbid. Tell us something cheerful. Dr. Vine's smile was thin. Cheerful? In my field, beauty and danger are intertwined. Take the oleander lovely flowers, deadly poison. One leaf can stop a heart. Mrs. Harrow, her needlework forgotten, looked up. My late husband used to say the same about people. Beautiful on the outside, poison within. He was a detective, you know. Worked on a case years ago. A poisoner who killed 3 men before vanishing. They never caught him. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. 3 men, you say? How tragic. Did he ever mention a photograph from that case? Mrs. Harrow's eyes flickered with surprise. A photograph? Yes, he did. He said it was the only clue. They had a grainy image of the suspect at a train station. But it was lost in a fire at the precinct. The pieces were falling into place. But Miss Marple needed more. She turned to Javier, who had been strumming softly in the corner. And you, young man, surely you have a story from St. Lucian. Javier's fingers paused on the guitar strings. I don't know about stories, ma'am, but there's a legend here about a woman who poisoned her lovers with a flower that grows only on the cliffs. They say her spirit still wanders, seeking revenge. Revenge, Miss Marple mused. A powerful motive. Tell me, Javier, have you ever seen anything unusual near the Colonel's bungalow? Javier's eyes darted to Victor, then away. Maybe. The night he died, I was playing. Late. Saw a shadow moving near his porch. Thought it was a guest, but they moved too quick. Victor snorted. Shadows, Javier. You've been listening to too many ghost stories. The tension in the room was palpable now, the candlelight casting long shadows across the table. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. Mr. Crane, you mentioned working in London. Did you ever meet Colonel Hargreaves there? He was quite the traveler, I understand. Victor's smile faltered. Hargreaves? No, we might have crossed paths, but I don't recall. Liar. Dr. Vines muttered, her voice barely audible. Victor's head snapped toward her, but before he could speak, Mr. Langley stood, his face flushed. Enough of this, he said, his voice thick. All this talk of poison and murder, it's nonsense. I'm going to my room. As he stormed off, Miss Marple noted the slight tremble in his hands. The note Leela had found suggested he was being threatened. But for what? Silence, the note had said. Silence about what? The storm raged on, the wind rattling the shutters. Miss Marple excused herself, claiming fatigue, but instead slipped into the resort's small library, a quiet room lined with dog-eared novels and outdated travel guides. She needed to think, to piece together the fragments. The Colonel's diary, the missing photograph, the note to Langley, the shadow Javier saw, it all pointed to a secret buried in the past. One someone was killing to keep hidden. She opened the diary again, her eyes lingering on the 3 stars, one shadow phrase. A sudden thought struck her. What if the stars weren't people, but events? 3 murders, perhaps, tied to one shadowy figure. The Colonel's recognition of that figure had been his death sentence, and the photograph, wherever it was, held the key. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Leela stood in the doorway, her face pale. Miss Marple, I followed Dr. Vines after dinner. She went to the greenhouse. Even in the rain, she was burning. Something papers, I think. I couldn't get close, but it looked important. Miss Marple's heart quickened. You're a brave girl, Leela. Did you see anything else? Leela hesitated. There was a man with her. I couldn't see his face, but he was tall, like Mr. Crane. They were arguing, and she sounded scared. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Dr. Vines, with her knowledge of poisons, was a likely suspect, but her fear suggested she might be a pawn, not the mastermind. Victor, on the other hand, had the motive blackmail, a hidden past and the opportunity, but she needed proof. Leela, she said, her voice firm, tomorrow, I'll need you to check Dr. Vine's room. Look for anything unusual, papers, vials, anything that might connect to the colonel. But be careful. Leela nodded, her eyes wide but determined. I will. Miss Marple, I trust you. As Leela left, Miss Marple leaned back, the diary open in her lap. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing within the resort, and she knew the next few days would be crucial. The 3 stars, one shadow clue, was a thread she could pull, and she intended to unravel it, no matter how tightly it was woven into the fabric of St. Lucian's secrets. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and Miss Marple closed her eyes, picturing the faces of the guests. One of them was a killer, and she was closer than ever to unmasking them. The photograph, the diary, the poison, they were all pieces of a puzzle she was born to solve, and solve it she would, before the storm broke and the killer struck again. Chapter 6. A dangerous dance. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving St. Lucian bathed in the sultry glow of twilight. The Golden Coconut Resort buzzed with anticipation for the Calypso night, a weekly spectacle that drew every guest and staff member into its vibrant orbit. Torches flickered along the open-air pavilion, their flames casting playful shadows on the woven palm frond roof. The air thrummed with the rhythm of steel drums, their syncopated beats mingling with the distant crash of waves and the chatter of guests sipping rum-laced cocktails. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small wicker table near the edge of the pavilion, adjusted her shawl against the evening breeze. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, scanned the crowd with the precision of a hawk circling its prey. The Calypso band, led by Javier, the local musician with a voice like molasses and a grin that could charm the stars, was in full swing. His fingers danced over the guitar strings, coaxing out a melody that made hips sway and laughter spill. Miss Marple noted how Javier's gaze lingered on Margot Steele, the glamorous actress whose sequin dress caught the torchlight like a mirror. Margot moved with the grace of a panther, her laughter a little too loud, her gestures a touch too theatrical, as if she were performing for an unseen audience. Victor, her manager, hovered nearby, his angular face taut with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Jealousy, perhaps, or something darker. Another pineapple punch. Miss Marple, Leela, the young maid, appeared at her side, her tray balanced with a practiced ease. Her dark eyes flickered nervously toward the crowd, and Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in her hands. No, thank you, dear, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but firm. But do sit for a moment. You look as if you've seen a ghost. Leela hesitated, then perched on the edge of a chair, her apron twisted in her fingers. It's just, everyone's so lively tonight, but I can't shake this feeling. Like, something's wrong. She glanced at Javier, who was now crooning a love ballad. His eyes locked on Margot. He's trouble, isn't he? Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. Trouble comes in many forms, Leela, Sometimes it wears a smile. She patted the girl's hand. Keep your eyes open, as we agreed. And don't be afraid. You're braver than you think. Leela managed a small nod before slipping back into the crowd, her tray bobbing like a buoy. Miss Marple's attention shifted to Dr. Clara Vines, the botanist, who stood apart from the revelry. Her linen dress as crisp as her demeanor. She clutched a small satchel, her fingers tightening around it whenever someone approached. Earlier that day, Miss Marple had overheard her muttering about the Vicia peruviana, a plant she'd described as beautifully lethal during a lecture to curious guests. Now, as the band struck up a faster tune, Dr. Vines edged toward the path leading to the resort's greenhouse, her movements deliberate. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and followed at a discreet distance. The path wound through a grove of hibiscus and frangipani, their heavy scents cloaking the air. The greenhouse loomed ahead, its glass panes glinting under the moon. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, her ears catching the faint clink of glass inside. Peering through a gap in the door, she saw Dr. Vines bent over a workbench, her hands gloved as she poured a viscous liquid from a beaker into a vial. A notebook lay open beside her, its pages filled with precise handwriting and diagrams of plants Miss Marple didn't recognize. Careful, Clara, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Secrets grow thorns in a place like this. She slipped back to the pavilion just as the music reached a crescendo. The dance floor was a whirl of color, guests twirling, staff weaving through with trays, and Javier now leading Margot in a spirited meringue. Victor watched from the bar, his jaw tight, his drink untouched. Miss Marple settled back into her seat, her mind piecing together the evening's fragments. Javier's flirtations, Victor's tension, Dr. Vines' clandestine work, and the ever-present shadow of the Colonel's death, its bitter almond scent still vivid in her memory. The night took a sharp turn when Mrs. Eleanor Harrow, the quiet widow who kept to herself, approached the bar for a drink. She was an unassuming figure, her gray hair pinned neatly, her dress a muted blue that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the torchlight. Miss Marple had noted her earlier, sitting alone with a book, her eyes occasionally darting toward the other guests as if searching for something or someone. Now, as Mrs. Harrow accepted a glass of coconut rum from the bartender, her hand trembled slightly. She took a sip, then another, before her face paled. Her glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone floor, and she swayed, clutching the bar for support. Oh, my! Miss Marple was on her feet in an instant, her small frame surprisingly swift as she reached Mrs. Harrow's side. Leela, fetch some water quickly now. The music faltered, and heads turned. Javier leapt from the stage, his guitar abandoned, while Margot froze mid-step, her eyes wide. Victor pushed through the crowd, his voice sharp. What's happened? Is she ill? She's fainted, Miss Marple said calmly, though her mind raced. She knelt beside Mrs. Harrow, whose breathing was shallow but steady. The spilled drink glistened on the floor, its scent faintly acrid, not the sweet coconut she'd expected. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the shards of glass, her movements subtle as she tucked a small piece into her handkerchief. Someone, help me move her to a chair. Javier and a waiter lifted Mrs. Harrow gently, settling her into a cushioned seat. Leela returned with a glass of water, her face pale. Will she be all right? She will be, Miss Marple said, her tone reassuring but her eyes scanning the crowd. Dr. Vines had reappeared, her satchel still clutched tightly, her expression unreadable. Victor hovered nearby, his hands fidgeting, while Margot knelt beside Mrs. Harrow, fanning her with a napkin. The widow's eyes fluttered open, and she gasped, her voice a whisper. I felt so strange, like my heart was racing. There, Miss Marple soothed, pressing the water to Mrs. Harrow's lips. Sip slowly, dear. You're safe now. But safe was a fragile word in St. Lucian, Miss Marple knew. As the band resumed playing, softer now, she guided Mrs. Harrow to a quieter corner, away from prying eyes. The widow's hands trembled as she clutched Miss Marple's arm. I don't know what happened, she murmured. One moment I was fine, and then it was like a fire in my chest. Did you notice anything odd about your drink? Miss Marple asked gently, her tone as unassuming as a village gossip inquiring about the weather. Mrs. Harrow frowned, her brow creasing. It tasted sharp, not like rum at all, but I only took a sip or two. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. A sharp taste, a racing heart, a sudden collapse. The signs pointed to something deliberate, something like the Colonel's bitter almond demise. She glanced at the bar, where the bartender was wiping down the counter, his movements a little too hurried. Rest here, Mrs. Harrow. I'll have Leela keep an eye on you. She beckoned Leela over, whispering instructions to stay close and ensure no one offered the widow another drink. Then, with a polite smile, Miss Marple drifted back toward the pavilion, her eyes catching Dr. Vine slipping away again, this time toward the resort's kitchen. The botanist's absence during Mrs. Harrow's collapse hadn't gone unnoticed, nor had the vial Miss Marple had seen in the greenhouse. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with cooks chopping fruit and servers darting in and out. Miss Marple entered under the pretense of requesting a cup of tea, her presence barely registering amid the chaos. Dr. Vine stood near a counter, speaking in low tones to a young cook who nodded nervously. Miss Marple caught the words special blend before Dr. Vines noticed her, and abruptly straightened, her satchel tucked under her arm. Miss Marple, Dr. Vines said, her voice bright but strained. What brings you here? Craving a late-night snack? Oh, just a spot of tea, Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. Though I must say, your knowledge of local plants is fascinating. I overheard you mention a special blend. Is it for the cocktails? Dr. Vine's eyes narrowed slightly, but she recovered quickly. Just a herbal infusion I'm experimenting with. Nothing exciting, I'm afraid. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of innocent curiosity. I do admire your expertise. Though one must be careful with herbs, mustn't one? Some can be so unpredictable. The botanist's smile tightened, and she excused herself, brushing past Miss Marple with a rustle of linen. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the counter where Dr. Vines had stood. A small jar of dried leaves sat unnoticed by the cooks, its label smudged but legible. Nerium oleander. Her memory flicked to Dr. Vine's lecture. Oleander, a plant as deadly as it was beautiful, capable of causing heart palpitations and worse. She made a mental note to revisit the greenhouse later. When the night was quieter, back at the pavilion, the calypso night had regained its rhythm. Though the mood was subdued, Javier was back on stage, his voice soulful as he sang of lost love and island secrets. Margot danced alone now, her movements slower, her eyes darting toward Victor, who stood at the bar, his fingers drumming impatiently. Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Harrow, who was sipping water under Lila's watchful eye. Feeling better, dear? Miss Marple asked, settling beside her. Mrs. Harrow nodded, though her eyes were troubled. I don't know what came over me. I've never fainted before. She hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple, there's something I haven't told anyone. My late husband, Charles. He was a detective. He worked on a case years ago, a murder case. Colonel Brant knew him. They corresponded about a killer who was never caught. I think that killer might be here. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. That's a serious matter. Mrs. Harrow, do you have any proof? A name, perhaps? Mrs. Harrow shook her head, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Only suspicions. Charles always said the killer was clever, charming, someone you'd never suspect. When I saw the Colonel at dinner that first night, he looked at someone in this very resort and his face changed, like he'd seen a ghost. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. The Colonel's diary had mentioned a face from the past, and now Mrs. Harrow's story added weight to the suspicion that the killer was among them. Victor's nervous demeanor, Dr. Vine's secretive experiments, Javier's easy charm, each could fit the profile of a murderer hiding in plain sight. And then there was Margot, whose fear of a scandal suggested she knew more than she let on. The night wore on, the calypso music fading into softer, mournful tunes. Miss Marple excused herself from Mrs. Harrow, promising to check on her later, and made her way to the greenhouse once more. The resort was quiet now, the guests dispersing to their bungalows, the staff cleaning up. The greenhouse door was ajar, and Miss Marple slipped inside, her step silent on the dirt floor. The air was thick with the scent of earth and flowers, but something sharper lingered, a chemical tang that set her nerves on edge. She found Dr. Vine's notebook still open on the workbench, its pages illuminated by a single lantern. Miss Marple donned her reading glasses and scanned the text. The notes detailed a poison derived from oleander, its effects chillingly precise: nausea, dizziness, cardiac arrhythmia. A recipe followed, listing ingredients available in the greenhouse, including a rare fern Javier had mentioned, one tied to island legends of curses. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she read a final note. Dosage must be exact. Too much, and the victim dies instantly. Too little, and they linger, exposing the plan. A creak behind her made her turn, her heart skipping. Javier stood in the doorway, his guitar slung over his shoulder, his smile faltering. Miss Marple, what are you doing here? Oh, just admiring the plants, she said lightly, closing the notebook with a gentle hand. They're quite remarkable, aren't they? Though I dare say some are best left untouched. Javier's eyes flicked to the notebook, then back to her. You're a curious one, aren't you? Be careful, miss. Curiosity can lead to trouble in a place like this. Trouble, my dear boy, is an old friend of mine, Miss Marple replied, her smile unwavering. But I find it's often the curious who uncover the truth. Javier hesitated, then nodded, stepping back into the night. Miss Marple waited until his footsteps faded, then tucked the notebook under her shawl. It was evidence, perhaps not enough to accuse anyone yet, but enough to keep her one step ahead of the poisoner. As she left the greenhouse, the moon hung low, casting long shadows across the resort. The calypso night had ended, but the dance of danger was far from over. Mrs. Harrow's revelation about her husband's connection to the Colonel had opened a new thread in the tapestry of St. Lucian's mystery. Miss Marple returned to her bungalow, her mind weaving together the clues. The Colonel's death, the bitter almond scent, Dr. Vine's poison, Victor's jealousy, Javier's charm, and now the widow's tale of a killer who had eluded justice for decades. She sat by her window, the sea whispering secrets beyond the glass, and made a silent vow to protect the innocent and unmask the guilty. The night had been a dangerous dance, But Miss Marple was no stranger to the steps. As she blew out her candle, the image of Mrs. Harrow's pale face lingered in her mind, along with the sharp taste of a drink that should have been sweet. Tomorrow, she would follow the trail of the torn letter found on the beach, and perhaps confront Victor about his late-night wanderings near the Colonel's bungalow. For now, she rested, her dreams filled with the rhythm of calypso and the scent of poison blooming in the dark. Chapter 7. Shadows in the sand. The morning sun hung low over St. Lucian, casting long, lazy shadows across the powdery beach. The air was thick with the scent of salt and hibiscus, and the gentle lapping of waves provided a deceptive calm after the previous night's chaos. Miss Jane Marple, clad in a light cotton dress and her ever-present wide-brimmed hat, strolled along the shore, her sensible shoes leaving faint imprints in the sand. To any onlooker, she was merely an elderly tourist admiring the Caribbean's beauty, but her sharp eyes scanned the beach for something more than seashells. The events of the past days weighed on her mind. The Colonel's sudden death, the missing photograph, the poisoned dart in Lilla's cart, and the cryptic diary hinting at a face from the past. Each clue was a thread in a tangled web, and Miss Marple knew the key to unraveling it lay in the smallest details. Her morning walk was no aimless wander. It was a deliberate hunt for answers. As she reached a secluded curve of the beach, where palm trees leaned conspiratorially toward the water, she spotted something glinting in the sand. Kneeling with surprising agility for her age, she brushed away the grains to reveal a torn scrap of paper, its edges frayed as if kissed by the tide. The ink was smudged but legible, written in a hurried scrawl. "Silence the talker before he ruins everything." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The Colonel, with his boisterous tales and that mysterious photograph, had clearly been the talker. But who had wanted him silenced? She tucked the letter into her handbag, her mind already weaving connections. The Colonel's death, dismissed as a heart attack, bore the telltale bitter almond scent of cyanide. The photograph he'd bragged about, tied to a decades-old murder, was missing. And now this note, washed ashore like a confession from the sea. Miss Marple straightened, her gaze sweeping the horizon. The resort, with its whitewashed bungalows and vibrant gardens, looked idyllic, but she knew darkness lurked beneath its charm. Her thoughts were interrupted by a distant shout. Turning, she saw Javier, the local musician, jogging toward her. His dark hair was tousled, and his linen shirt was unbuttoned, revealing a necklace of wooden beads that swayed as he moved. "Miss Marple," he called, his voice carrying a mix of urgency and charm. "You're up early, looking for treasures." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling with warmth that belied her scrutiny. "Only the kind that tells a story, Javier. And you? What brings you to the beach at this hour?" He slowed, catching his breath. "Couldn't sleep. Too much noise in my head after last night." His gaze flickered toward the resort, where the first stirrings of breakfast service were underway. "That dart in Lilla's cart. It's got everyone spooked." "You think it's connected to the Colonel?" Miss Marple tilted her head, considering him. Javier's easy charm and soulful guitar melodies had won over many at the resort, but she sensed a guarded edge beneath his nonchalance. "Perhaps," she said carefully. "But I wonder, Javier, if you've seen anything unusual lately. You're often out late, playing for the guests. Eyes and ears like yours, Miss Little." He hesitated, his fingers toying with his necklace. "You don't miss much either, do you?" he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "All right, I'll tell you something. The night the Colonel died, I saw Victor, that's Margot's manager, skulking around the Colonel's bungalow. Looked like he was waiting for someone, or something. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained placid. Victor, with his slick suits and evasive manner, had been on her radar since the Calypso night. His argument with Margot about a scandal, coupled with this new information, painted him as a man with secrets. Waiting, you say. Did he see you? Nah, Javier replied, kicking at the sand. I was in the shadows, heading back from a late set. He didn't notice me, but he was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. Thank you, Javier, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. You've been most helpful, but do be careful. Shadows can hide more than just musicians. He chuckled, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. You're a funny one, Miss Marple. I'll keep my eyes open. With a wave, he jogged off toward the resort, his silhouette blending into the morning light. Miss Marple resumed her walk, her mind racing. Victor's presence near the Colonel's bungalow on the night of the murder was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but she needed more, something to tie the torn letter, the photograph, and the poison together. As she neared the resort's edge, where the beach met a dense grove of mangroves, a sudden crackle of flames caught her attention. Smoke curled upward from the direction of the greenhouse, where Dr. Clara Vines conducted her botanical research. Miss Marple quickened her pace, her heart thudding not from exertion but from the certainty that this was no accident. By the time she reached the greenhouse, a small crowd had gathered. Resort staff, a few curious guests, and Mr. Du Bois, the elderly gardener, who was shouting orders to douse the flames with buckets of water. The greenhouse, a glass sandwood structure filled with exotic plants, was ablaze at one end. The fire licked at the wooden beams, sending tendrils of smoke into the sky. Dr. Vines stood at the edge of the chaos, her face pale and her hands clenched. My work, she cried, her voice cracking. Years of research, gone. Miss Marple approached, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the panic around her. Dr. Vines, what happened here? She asked, her tone laced with sympathy but sharp with curiosity. Dr. Vines turned, her green eyes wild. I don't know. I was in my room when I heard the alarms. By the time I got here, it was already burning. Someone must have done this deliberately. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the greenhouse, where the flames were now under control, leaving a charred section of shelves and shattered pots. Deliberately, you say? That's a serious accusation. What was stored in that part of the greenhouse? Dr. Vines hesitated, her fingers twisting a strand of her auburn hair. Just plants, rare ones, nothing valuable to anyone but me. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She recalled the notebook she'd glimpsed in the greenhouse during the Calypso night, filled with notes on a poison derived from local flora. If that notebook was among the destroyed items, someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Perhaps, she said softly, we should see what can be salvaged. Ignoring Dr. Vine's protests, Miss Marple stepped closer to the smoldering remains, her handkerchief pressed to her nose against the acrid smoke. The staff had extinguished the fire, but the air was thick with the scent of burnt leaves and chemicals. Among the debris, she spotted a singed page, its edges curling like a dying leaf. She knelt, careful not to draw attention, and slipped it into her handbag alongside the torn letter. Du Bois joined her, his weathered face creased with worry. This is bad, Miss Marple, he said in a low voice. Those plants, some were dangerous. Clara Dr. Vines, she was studying toxins, said it was for science, but I always wondered. Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. Thank you, Mr. Du Bois. I'd like to hear more about those plants later. For now, let's ensure no one else gets too curious about this mess. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the onlookers. Victor stood at the edge, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Margot, wrapped in a silk shawl, hovered nearby, her glamorous façade marred by a nervous tick in her jaw. The businessman, Mr. Hargrove, who had narrowly escaped poisoning at dinner, was barking orders at the staff, demanding an investigation. And Leela, the young maid, watched from a distance, her eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple returned to her bungalow, her mind a whirl of possibilities. The torn letter, Javier's sighting of Victor, and now the greenhouse fire, it all pointed to a desperate attempt to erase evidence. She sat at her small writing desk, spreading the singed page and the torn letter before her. The singed page was a fragment from Dr. Vine's notebook, detailing a chemical formula, C17H19NO3, a toxin derived from a rare Caribbean plant, capable of inducing cardiac arrest with no trace but a faint almond-like odor. The torn letter, with its ominous warning to silence the talker, suggested a motive tied to the Colonel's recognition of someone from his past. She leaned back, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she thought. Victor's presence at the Colonel's bungalow, Dr. Vine's expertise in poisons, and the missing photograph all converged on a single truth. Someone at the resort was not who they claimed to be, but who, and why risk such bold moves now? A knock at the door startled her. It was Leela, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Miss Marple, I found something," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "In Victor's room, when I was cleaning. It was hidden under the floorboard." Miss Marple ushered her inside, closing the door. "What did you find, dear?" Leela produced a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn but intact. "It's a journal. I didn't read much, but it mentions the Colonel and a woman named Elise." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Elise was the name of the murderer the Colonel had mentioned in his diary, a case from decades ago. She took the journal, her fingers steady despite the thrill of discovery. "You've done well, Leela. But you mustn't tell anyone about this." "Not yet." Leela nodded, her eyes bright with trust. "I won't. But Miss Marple, I'm scared. What if whoever did this comes after me?" Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "You're under my protection now, Leela, and I promise you, I'll get to the bottom of this before anyone else is hurt." As Leela left, Miss Marple opened the journal. The pages were filled with Victor's tight, precise handwriting, detailing meetings with Margot, payments to unnamed parties, and a chilling entry. "The Colonel saw her. He knows. If he talks, it's over. Elise's shadow must stay buried." Miss Marple closed the journal, her mind racing. Elise's shadow, the Colonel's photograph, the greenhouse fire. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. She needed to confront Victor, but not yet, not until she had undeniable proof. For now, the singed page and the journal were her weapons, and she would wield them with the precision of a surgeon. The day unfolded with deceptive normalcy. The resort staff worked to clear the greenhouse debris, while guests lounged by the pool, their laughter a stark contrast to the undercurrent of suspicion. Miss Marple joined them, her knitting in hand, her eyes missing nothing. She watched Victor and Margot, their interaction strained, as if each was waiting for the other to crack. Dr. Vine's, meanwhile, was conspicuously absent, claiming a headache. At lunch, Miss Marple sat with Mr. Hargrove, the businessman, who was still shaken from his near poisoning. This place is cursed, he grumbled, pushing his plate away. First the Colonel, now that fire. I'm leaving tomorrow. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. A wise choice, perhaps. But tell me, Mr. Hargrove, did you know the Colonel well? He shrugged, his eyes darting away. Met him a few times. Loud fellow, always talking about his army days. Mentioned some old case once, a murderer he helped catch. Said he had proof, a picture, or something. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept her tone light. A picture? How fascinating. Did he show it to you? No, Hargrove said, frowning. Said it was private. But he was excited, like he'd found something big. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the bar. Javier, strumming his guitar, had launched into a lively tune, drawing a crowd. Margot joined him, her laughter bright but brittle, as if she were performing for an unseen audience. Victor watched from a distance, his eyes dark with something Miss Marple couldn't quite name: anger, fear, or perhaps both. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple returned to the beach, hoping to clear her mind. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She retraced her steps to where she'd found the torn letter, wondering if the tide had brought more secrets ashore. Instead, she found Mr. Du Bois, his hands dirty from tending the gardens. Miss Marple, he said, tipping his straw hat. You're always where the trouble is, aren't you? She chuckled softly. Trouble seems to find me, Mr. Du Bois. Tell me, those plants in the greenhouse, were any of them the kind that could silence a talker? His eyes widened, then narrowed with understanding. You're a sharp one. Yes, there was one, a rare vine, called Devil's Breath. Clara was obsessed with it. Said it could stop a heart clean, no trace. But it's gone. Now, burned up. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The singed pages formula matched Devil's Breath, and Victor's journal tied him to the Colonel's death. But Dr. Vine's role remained murky. Was she a victim of blackmail, or a willing accomplice? As night fell, the resort buzzed with preparations for a beachside dinner. Tiki torches cast flickering shadows, and the air was alive with the scent of grilled fish and coconut. Miss Marple joined the guests, her knitting bag at her side, the journal and singed page safely tucked within. She watched Victor closely, noting his forced smiles as he mingled. Margot, radiant in a flowing dress, avoided his gaze, her attention fixed on Javier's music. Halfway through the meal, a scream shattered the festive mood. Leela, serving drinks, had dropped a tray, her face ashen. It's him, she stammered, pointing at Victor. I saw him put something in Miss Margot's drink. The crowd froze, all eyes on Victor. He laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. Nonsense. The girl's imagining things. Miss Marple rose, her voice cutting through the tension. Perhaps we should check, Victor, for everyone's peace of mind. Before he could protest, she signaled to Mr. Du Bois, who swiftly retrieved the glass. Miss Marple held it to the light, sniffing carefully. The faint, telltale scent of bitter almonds confirmed her fears. Cyanide, she said quietly, her eyes locking onto Victor's. The same as the Colonel's. Victor's face drained of color. This is absurd. I'm being framed. Margot, trembling, stepped forward. He's lying. I saw him with a vial yesterday. I thought it was for his nerves. But the crowd erupted in murmurs. But Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. Leela, fetch the vial you found in Victor's room. And Mr. Du Bois, please ensure no one leaves. As Leela hurried off, Victor lunged toward the darkness, but Javier tackled him, pinning him to the sand. "Stay put," Javier growled, his easy charm replaced by steel. Leela returned with the vial, its skull symbol gleaming in the torchlight. Miss Marple examined it, her heart heavy but resolute. "This matches the formula from Dr. Vine's notebook," she said. "Victor, you have much to explain." He struggled, his eyes wild. "It's not what you think. Clara, she's the one who made it." Miss Marple shook her head. "We'll hear from Dr. Vine soon enough. But for now, Victor, I suggest you cooperate. The truth has a way of surfacing, like a letter in the tide." As the staff restrained Victor, Miss Marple glanced at the singed page in her bag. Its formula, the key to unlocking the poisoner's plot. The night was far from over, but she felt a quiet satisfaction. The shadows in the sand had yielded their secrets, and justice was one step closer. Chapter 8. The maids discover the tropical air hung heavy with the scent of frangipani and salt. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting St. Lucian's sky in hues of tangerine and violet, the golden coconut resort buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, its idyllic façade cracking under the weight of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the fading light, sat on the veranda of her bungalow, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. To an outsider, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying a quiet evening, but her sharp eyes darted across the resort's lush grounds, cataloging every glance, every whispered exchange among the guests. The events of the past days, the colonel's sudden death, the missing photograph, the poisoned dart in Lila's cleaning cart had woven a web of intrigue that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. Her mind, honed by years of observing human nature in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, buzzed with possibilities. The vial of poison, the botanist's notebook, the actress's secret each was a thread, and she was close to tracing them to their source. But tonight, something new was afoot, and it was Leela, the young maid with trembling hands and wide eyes, who held the key. Leela approached Miss Marple's bungalow, just as the last rays of sunlight vanished, her footsteps hesitant. On the sandy path, the girl's usual vibrancy was dimmed, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and offered a warm smile, gesturing to the wicker chair opposite her. "Leela, my dear, you look as though you've seen a ghost. Come, sit. Tell me what's troubling you." Leela perched on the edge of the chair, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "Miss Marple, I found something. I didn't know what to do, but you said to come to you if I saw anything strange." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet encouragement. "You did exactly right. Now, take a deep breath and tell me everything." Leela glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to emerge from the lengthening shadows. It was in Mr. Victor's room, Margaret's manager. "I was cleaning this afternoon, and, well, I wasn't supposed to touch his things, but a drawer was half open, and I saw it. A vial, small, with a skull symbol on it, like something from a chemist's shop, but wrong. It was hidden under his shirts." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "A vial, you say? Did you touch it?" Leela shook her head vigorously. "No, ma'am. I was too scared. It looked dangerous. And Mr. Victor, he's been so odd lately, always watching everyone, snapping at Margot. I thought you should know." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "You were wise to come to me, Leela. This is important, but we must be careful. Can you show me where you found it? I'd like to see it myself." Leela's eyes widened. "Go back to his room. What if he catches us? Miss Marple's smile was reassuring, a blend of grandmotherly warmth and steely resolve. Leave that to me, my dear. I've dealt with my share of slippery characters. We'll be discreet. The resort was alive with the hum of evening activity guests, sipping cocktails by the pool, the distant strum of Javier's guitar weaving through the air. Miss Marple and Leela moved through the shadows, skirting the illuminated paths to avoid notice. Victor's bungalow, a sleek structure with a thatched roof and wide windows, stood at the edge of the resort, its interior dark save for a faint glow from a desk lamp. Leela led the way, her keyring jangling softly as she unlocked the door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and cigar smoke. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room. A neatly made bed, a suitcase in the corner, and a mahogany desk cluttered with papers. Leela pointed to a dresser against the far wall. There, in the top drawer, Miss Marple approached, her movements deliberate. She pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve whereupon, of course, with a delicate lace edge, and used it to open the drawer. Nestled among neatly folded shirts was a small glass vial, no larger than a thimble, its label bearing a stark black skull. She tilted it carefully, noting the viscous liquid inside, its faint greenish hue catching the lamplight. "This is no prop," Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. The vial matched the description in Dr. Vine's notebook. The one she'd glimpsed in the greenhouse, a concoction derived from a rare island plant, potent enough to kill with a single drop. But why was it in Victor's possession? Was he the poisoner? Or was he being framed? Lila's voice trembled. "Miss Marple, what do we do?" Before Miss Marple could answer, a sharp sound cut through the silence, a creak from the veranda. Leela gasped, and Miss Marple pressed a finger to her lips, motioning for the girl to hide behind the dresser. The door swung open, and Victor strode in, his angular face illuminated by the lamp. He froze, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Miss Marple. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice smooth but edged with menace. "What's the village sleuth doing in my room?" Miss Marple straightened, her expression unruffled. "Oh, Mr. Victor, I'm terribly sorry. I was looking for my reading glasses, silly me. I thought I might have left them here during the Calypso night. The maid was kind enough to let me check." Victor's gaze flicked to the open drawer, then back to Miss Marple. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Glasses, eh? You're a long way from your bungalow, Miss Marple, and that drawer doesn't look like a place for spectacles." Miss Marple clutched her handkerchief, the vial concealed within its folds. "My eyes aren't what they used to be, I'm afraid. I do get muddled, but I'll leave you to your evening. Come along, Leela." Leela emerged, her face pale, and followed Miss Marple to the door. Victor's voice stopped them. "Careful, Miss Marple. St. Lucian's a paradise, but it's got its dangers. Wouldn't want you stumbling into something toxic." Miss Marple turned, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "Oh, I'm quite careful, Mr. Victor, and I always find what I'm looking for, eventually." Back in the safety of Miss Marple's bungalow, Lila's nerves unraveled. "He knows, Miss Marple. He saw us. What if he comes after me?" Miss Marple poured the girl a glass of water from a pitcher, her hands steady. "He may suspect, but he has no proof. You've done wonderfully, Leela. Now, we must keep this vial safe. Do you have somewhere secure, a locker, perhaps?" Leela nodded. "There's a staff safe in the housekeeping office. I can hide it there." "Good girl," Miss Marple said, handing her the vial, still wrapped in the handkerchief. "Lock it away, and tell no one." "Not yet." As Leela hurried off, Miss Marple sank into her chair, her mind piecing together the puzzle. Victor's presence in the Colonel's death was now undeniable, but the why eluded her. Was he protecting Margaret's secrets, as the overheard argument suggested? Or was there a deeper motive, tied to the Colonel's photograph and the face from the past? In his diary, the night deepened, and the resort sounds faded, replaced by the rhythmic crash of waves. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Dr. Vines, whose botanical expertise was no coincidence. The greenhouse fire, the poisoned dart, the vial all pointed to a collaboration, or perhaps a double cross. She needed more information, and the resort's dinner that evening promised a chance to observe. The dining hall was a spectacle of crystal and candlelight, the tables adorned with orchids and flickering lanterns. Guests mingled, their laughter tinged with unease. As if the Colonel's death lingered like a shadow, Miss Marple, in her modest lavender dress, took a seat near the edge, her vantage point perfect for watching the room. Margot Steele, radiant in a crimson gown, held court at the center table, her laughter brittle. Victor hovered nearby, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Dr. Clara Vines, in a severe black dress, sat alone, her fingers tapping nervously against her glass. Javier strummed a soft melody in the corner, his gaze lingering on Margot, while Mr. Dubois, the gardener, shuffled in with a tray of fresh herbs, his weathered face unreadable. Then it happened, a sudden, piercing shout from Margaret's table. All heads turned as she stood, her face flushed, pointing at Dr. Vines. I know what you're up to, Clara. Don't think you can hide it." Dr. Vine's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. "What are you talking about, Margot? You're hysterical." Victor stepped between them, his voice low but commanding. "Enough. Both of you. Not here." The room buzzed with whispers as guests craned their necks. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, catching the flicker of fear in Dr. Vine's expression and the barely concealed fury in Victor's. Margot, trembling, sank back into her chair, her outburst drawing every eye. Miss Marple rose, her movement slow but deliberate, and approached the table. "Oh, dear, what a fuss. Is everything all right, Miss Steele?" Margaret's eyes darted to Victor, then back to Miss Marple. "It's nothing. Just nerves. The heat, you know." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "The tropics can be overwhelming. Perhaps a walk in the fresh air?" Victor's hand tightened on Margaret's shoulder. "She's fine, Miss Marple. Just a misunderstanding." But Dr. Vines, her composure fraying, stood abruptly. "I need some air. Myself." She strode toward the veranda, her heels clicking sharply. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind racing. The argument was no mere spat, it was a crack in the façade, revealing the tension between Victor and Dr. Vines. Margaret's accusation suggested she knew something about the botanist's activities, perhaps tied to the vial. But why confront her now, in public? Was Margot trying to deflect suspicion, or was she genuinely afraid? Later that evening, Miss Marple slipped out to the gardens, where the moon cast silver light over the hibiscus and palm trees. She found Mr. Dubois tending a bed of night-blooming jasmine, his hands steady despite his age. "Evening, Mr. Dubois," she said softly. "You've a way with these plants. Ever come across one that could harm as well as heal?" The old gardener's eyes twinkled, though his expression remained guarded. "Oh, St. Lucian's got her secrets, miss. Plants that can cure a fever or stop a heart, depending on the hand that wields them. Dr. Vines, now she knows more than most." Miss Marple nodded. I thought as much. And Mr. Victor, does he strike you as a man who knows his way around such things? Mr. Du Bois chuckled, low and rumbling. That one. He's got the look of a man who'd sell his own shadow if it turned a profit. But plants? No. He's no gardener. If he's meddling with poison, he's got help. Miss Marple thanked him and returned to her bungalow, her thoughts swirling. The vial in Victor's room, the argument in the dining hall. Dr. Vine's nervous demeanor at all pointed to a conspiracy, but the pieces didn't yet fit. She needed to know more about Victor's past and Margot's role in it. The actresses. Fear was real, but was it fear of Victor or of being exposed? The next morning, Miss Marple sat with Leela in the housekeeping office, the vial now safely locked in the staff safe. Lila's courage had grown, her eyes bright with determination. I heard something else, Miss Marple, she whispered. Last night, after the dinner, I saw Dr. Vine sneaking into the greenhouse again. She was carrying a bag, and it looked heavy. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. You're a marvel, Leela. Keep watching, but stay safe. We're close to the truth. I can feel it. As Leela nodded, Miss Marple's mind turned to the greenhouse. Dr. Vine's experiments, the fire, the notebook all suggested she was the source of the poison. But Victor's possession of the vial hinted at a partnership, or perhaps a betrayal. And Margot, her outburst was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Was she a victim, a conspirator, or something else entirely? Miss Marple resolved to visit the greenhouse that night, under cover of darkness. If Dr. Vines was hiding something, it was there she'd find it. But she'd need to be careful. St. Lucian's paradise was proving to be a deadly trap, and the poisoner was still at large. The day passed in a blur of resort activities, snorkeling trips, a steel drum performance, a cooking class with local spices. Miss Marple played her part, chatting amiably with guests, her questions innocuous but probing. She learned that Victor had been Margot's manager for only a year, his past a mystery even to her. Dr. Vines, meanwhile, had arrived on the island months ago, ostensibly to study rare flora, but her frequent trips to the mainland raised eyebrows. And Javier, the musician, had a reputation for charming secrets out of guests, his easy smile a mask for sharp observation. As night fell, Miss Marple donned a dark shawl and slipped out, her steps silent on the sandy paths. The greenhouse loomed ahead, its glass panes glinting under the moon. She paused at the entrance, listening for movement. A faint rustle came from within, followed by the clink of glass inside. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of earth and blooms overwhelming. Dr. Vine stood at a workbench, her back to the door, sorting vials and leaves with meticulous care. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. Good evening, Dr. Vines. Working late, I see. Dr. Vines spun around, a syringe in her hand, its needle glinting. Miss Marple, what are you doing here? Oh, just a night stroll, Miss Marple said, her eyes fixed on the syringe. I find greenhouses fascinating. So many secrets in these plants, don't you think? Dr. Vine's grip tightened, but her voice was steady. They're just plants, nothing more. Miss Marple took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. And yet, some can kill, like the one used on the Colonel, or the dart in Lila's cart, or the vial in Victor's room. Dr. Vine's face paled, but before she could respond, a shadow moved at the greenhouse door. Victor stepped inside, his eyes cold. You're meddling in things you don't understand, old woman. Miss Marple's heart raced, but her voice remained calm. On the contrary, Mr. Victor, I understand quite well, and I think the authorities will, too, once they see that vial. Victor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the humid air. You think you've got it all figured out. You're out of your depth. But Dr. Vine's voice cut through, sharp and desperate. Victor, stop. She knows too much. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. The vial, the argument, the syringe, they were working together. But trust was fraying. She needed to act fast. Leela, she called softly, knowing the girl was nearby, watching as instructed. Now, dear. Leela burst from the shadows, a flashlight in hand, its beam blinding Victor. Dr. Vines dropped the syringe, and Miss Marple seized the moment, grabbing a nearby trowel and knocking the syringe away. Enough, she said, her voice ringing with authority. The game is up. Victor lunged, but Leela's quick thinking tripped him with a rake, sending him sprawling. Dr. Vines backed away, her hands raised. I didn't want this, she cried. He made me. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her resolve was iron. Tell that to the police. Dr. Vines. And you, Mr. Victor, don't move. Leela, fetch the resort manager. As Leela ran off, Miss Marple stood watch, the trowel still in hand. The greenhouse, once a sanctuary of growth, was now a stage for truth. Victor glared, but Dr. Vine's shoulders slumped, her secrets spilling out in halting whispers. The vial, she confessed, was hers, but Victor had coerced her into supplying it, threatening to expose her past. When the resort manager arrived with security, Victor was restrained, and the vial was secured. Miss Marple handed it over, her handkerchief protecting it from fingerprints. You'll want to test this, she said calmly, and I suspect you'll find it matches the Colonel's poison. As the chaos subsided, Miss Marple stepped outside, the night air cool against her skin. Leela, trembling but proud, stood beside her. You were so brave, Miss Marple, she said. Miss Marple smiled, patting the girl's hand. And so were you, my dear. Now, let's keep that vial safe. We're not done yet. The stars glittered above, and the resort settled into an uneasy quiet. But Miss Marple knew the truth was only half unearthed. Victor was a piece of the puzzle, but Margaret's role, and the deeper motive behind the Colonel's death, still lingered in the shadows. She would need to be sharper than ever to unmask the full truth in St. Lucian's deadly paradise. Chapter 9. Tides of suspicion. The sun hung low over St. Lucian, casting a golden sheen across the turquoise waves that lapped at the Golden Coconut Resort's private dock. The air was thick with the scent of hibiscus and salt, but beneath the tropical serenity, a current of unease rippled through the guests. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted slightly against the glare, sat on a wicker chair by the dock, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the horizon where a sleek yacht bobbed, its white hull gleaming like a promise of escape. The businessman, Mr. Harold Grayson, had announced a yacht party for the evening, inviting all the resort's guests in a grand gesture of goodwill. Miss Marple, however, sensed the invitation was less about generosity and more about distraction. Grayson, now fully recovered from his mysterious dizziness a few nights prior, had been strutting about the resort with renewed vigor, his tailored linen suit crisp despite the humidity. His booming laugh echoed from the bar as he regaled the actress, Margot Steele, with tales of his shipping empire. Margot, her auburn hair swept into an elegant updo, laughed politely, but Miss Marple noted the tightness around her eyes, a flicker of unease that betrayed her polished façade. Nearby, Dr. Clara Vines, the botanist, stood apart, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for something or someone. Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her satchel. Where Miss Marple knew a vial of suspicious liquid lay hidden, the elderly sleuth's thoughts drifted to the events of the past days. The colonel's sudden death, the bitter almond scent in his glass, the missing photograph, and the poisoned dart found in Lila's cleaning cart. Each clue was a thread in a tangled web, and tonight's yacht party, Miss Marple suspected, would pull those threads tighter or snap them entirely. As the guests gathered at the dock, Miss Marple observed their interactions with her usual quiet scrutiny. Victor, Margot's manager, hovered close to his star, his sharp features taut with what could have been nerves or calculation. Javier, the local musician, strummed a soft calypso tune on his guitar, his dark eyes darting between Margot and Victor. The widow, Mrs. Harrow, clung to her shawl despite the warmth, her pale face etched with worry. Lila, the young maid, lingered at the edge of the group, her apron smoothed nervously as she caught Miss Marple's eye and offered a small, determined nod. The sleuth had entrusted Lila with watching the guests, and the girl's courage was proving invaluable. "Miss Marple, you're joining us, I hope," Grayson called, his voice carrying over the chatter. "A night on the water will do wonders for the soul." Miss Marple smiled demurely, her needles pausing. "I wouldn't miss it, Mr. Grayson. The sea has a way of revealing truths, don't you think?" Grayson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered with a hearty chuckle. "Quite right. Let's cast off." Then, the yacht, christened the Siren's Call, was a marvel of modern luxury: polished teak decks, cushioned lounges, and a bar stocked with crystal glasses that glinted under fairy lights strung along the railings. As the vessel glided away from the dock, the island receded into a silhouette of palms against the sunset. The guests mingled, their voices rising over the hum of the engine and the splash of waves. Miss Marple settled into a corner seat, her knitting resumed, but her ears were attuned to every word, every inflection. Dr. Vines stood alone at the bar, her fingers tracing the rim of an untouched glass of pineapple rum. Miss Marple noted the botanist's deliberate avoidance of the drinks, a stark contrast to the other guests who sipped freely. Victor, meanwhile, was busy at the bar, his movements quick and precise as he mixed a cocktail for Margot. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she saw him slip a small bottle from his pocket, its contents catching the light before he poured a few drops into the drink. The gesture was swift, almost imperceptible, but to Miss Marple, it was as loud as a shout. "Margot, darling, try this," Victor said, handing her the glass with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A special blend, just for you." Margot hesitated, her fingers brushing the stem of the glass. "You're too kind, Victor," she murmured, but her eyes flicked to Miss Marple, who gave the slightest shake of her head. Margot set the glass down untouched, feigning a laugh. "Perhaps later. I'm feeling a bit seasick already." Victor's jaw tightened, but he turned away, engaging Grayson in conversation about yacht maintenance. Miss Marple's mind raced. The vial in Victor's room, found by Lila and marked with a skull, matched the poison described in Dr. Vine's notebook. Was Victor the poisoner, or was Dr. Vines orchestrating a more elaborate scheme? The botanist's nervous demeanor and her avoidance of the drink suggested guilt, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances alone. As the yacht cruised farther from shore, the atmosphere grew festive, fueled by rum and Javier's music. He had abandoned his guitar for a steel drum, its vibrant notes filling the air. Guests danced, their shadows swaying on the deck. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Javier himself. His flirtations with Margot had grown bolder, and Victor's glares were becoming harder to ignore. Suddenly, Javier stumbled mid-performance, his drumstick clattering to the deck. He clutched his stomach, his face paling as he sank to his knees. "Javier!" Margot cried, rushing to his side. The other guests crowded around, their chatter turning to gasps. Miss Marple rose swiftly, her knitting abandoned, and knelt beside the musician. "Javier, what did you drink?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. He gasped, his words slurred. "Just the punch. At the bar." Miss Marple's gaze snapped to the bar, where Victor stood, his expression unreadable. Dr. Vines, however, had vanished from her spot. The sleuth's instincts flared. "Leela," she called softly, beckoning the maid. "Help me get him to the lounge, and fetch some water, clean water, from the sealed bottles below deck." Leela nodded, her eyes wide but resolute, and together they supported Javier to a cushioned bench. The other guests hovered, their questions overlapping. Grayson, ever the host, tried to restore order. "Just a bit of seasickness, folks. Let's give him air." Miss Marple ignored him, her fingers pressing gently against Javier's wrist. His pulse was rapid but steady, and his breathing, though labored, was improving. "Not seasickness," she murmured to Leela. "Something in the punch, but he's recovering." Which means it wasn't a lethal dose. This time, as Leela fetched the water, Miss Marple scanned the deck for Dr. Vines. The botanist reappeared from below deck, her satchel clutched tightly. Miss Marple caught her eye, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Dr. Vines filled with a mix of fear and defiance. The sleuth made a mental note to investigate the botanist's activities further. But her immediate concern was Victor. His tampering with Margaret's drink suggested he was escalating his plans, and Javier's sudden illness confirmed it. "Mrs. Harrow," Miss Marple said, turning to the widow, who stood wringing her hands nearby, "would you be so kind as to keep an eye on Javier? I need to speak with Mr. Dubois." The widow nodded, her face pale but determined. "Of course, Miss Marple. Will he be all right?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied, her tone reassuring. "But we must be vigilant." She found Mr. Dubois near the stern, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he stared at the dark water. The elderly gardener had been her ally since their first conversation, his knowledge of St. Lucian's secrets proving invaluable. "Mr. Dubois," she said softly, "I need your help." Dr. Vines slipped below deck just before Javier fell ill. "I suspect she's tampering with something in the greenhouse or her supplies. Could you watch her movements when we return to shore?" Mr. Dubois' eyes, sharp despite his age, met hers. "You think she's the one poisoning folks?" "I think she's involved," Miss Marple said carefully. "But the threads are tangled. Victor's hands aren't clean either. We need evidence." Mr. Dubois nodded, his expression grim. "I'll watch her like a hawk, Miss Marple. That greenhouse of hers. It's got plants that could kill a man in minutes. I've seen her tending them at odd hours." Miss Marple thanked him and returned to the deck, where Javier was sipping water, his color returning. Margot sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, while Victor watched from a distance. His eyes narrowed. The party continued, but the mood had shifted, the laughter now forced, the glances wary. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles clicking once more, but her mind was far from idle. As the yacht turned back toward St. Lucian, the stars emerged, their light reflected in the inky waves. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Colonel's diary, the missing photograph, and Mrs. Harrow's revelation about her husband's pursuit of a murderer. The clues were converging, but the puzzle was incomplete. Victor's actions tonight spiking Margaret's drink. Javier's sudden illness pointed to a man desperate to silence threats. But Dr. Vine's behavior, her secretive trips to the greenhouse, and her knowledge of poison suggested she was more than a bystander. The yacht docked, and the guests disembarked, their chatter subdued. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Dr. Vine's, who hurried toward the resort's gardens. Mr. Dubois gave her a knowing nod before following at a discreet distance. Leila approached, her face anxious but resolute. Miss Marple, I checked the punch bowl. There was a faint smell, like almonds, but sweeter. I didn't touch it. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Well done, Leila. Keep that to yourself for now. We're close to unraveling this, but we must tread carefully. As the guests dispersed to their bungalows, Miss Marple stood alone on the dock, the night air cool against her skin. The yacht party had been a stage, and the players have revealed more than they intended. Javier's recovery was a relief, but it raised new questions. Why a non-lethal dose? Was it a warning, a mistake, or part of a larger plan? And what was Dr. Vine's hiding in her greenhouse? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a memory of St. Mary Mead, where a seemingly innocent garden party had masked a deadly plot. People, she mused, were much the same wherever you went, driven by greed, fear, or revenge. Their secrets buried beneath smiles. But secrets, like tides, had a way of rising to the surface. She turned toward the resort, her steps light but purposeful. Tomorrow, she would follow the threads to their source. For now, the night held its own secrets, and Miss Marple was content to let them simmer. The truth, she knew, was waiting just beyond the horizon. Chapter 10. The widow's Talith tropical night pressed heavily on St. Lucian, the air thick with the promise of a storm. The Golden Coconut Resort, usually alive with the chatter of guests and the clink of glasses, felt subdued, as if the island itself held its breath. Miss Jane Marple sat on the veranda of her bungalow, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The faint glow of a lantern cast delicate shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She had just returned from a candlelit dinner where tensions among the guests had simmered like the heat before a downpour. The widow, Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, had lingered at the table, her pale hands trembling as she clutched her teacup, her gaze darting toward the darkened palms beyond the dining pavilion. Miss Marple had noticed, she always noticed, the widow's revelation earlier that day had been a quiet bombshell, dropped in the hushed tones of a woman unburdening a long-held secret. Mrs. Harrow had confided that her late husband, Detective Inspector Harrow, had once pursued a murderer, a shadowy figure tied to a decades-old case. That had also ensnared the late Colonel Brandt. The Colonel's diary, which Miss Marple had carefully studied, hinted at a face from the past he'd recognized at the resort. Mrs. Harrow's words had added weight to the suspicion that the killer was among them, hiding in plain sight, perhaps driven by vengeance or fear of exposure. Now, as the first rumbles of thunder rolled across the horizon, Miss Marple sensed the mystery tightening like a noose. She set her knitting aside and rose, her small frame moving with surprising agility toward the edge of the veranda. The sea was restless, waves crashing against the shore with a rhythm that echoed her own unease. The torn letter she'd found on the beach, a cryptic warning about silencing the talker, lay folded in her pocket, its edges frayed but its implications sharp. The Colonel's death, the poisoned dart in Lilla's cart, the businessman's dizziness, the actress Margaret's evasions, all were threads in a tapestry Miss Marple was determined to unravel. But Mrs. Harrow's story had introduced a new pattern, one that suggested the past was not buried but stalking the present. A sudden gust of wind rattled the palm fronds, and Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter. The resort was isolated tonight. The ferry to the mainland cancelled due to the brewing storm. The guests were trapped, their secrets confined within the golden glow of the resort's lanterns. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the yacht party. Earlier that evening, hosted by Mr. Reginald Thorne, the businessman who had narrowly escaped poisoning. The event had been a glittering affair, with calypso music drifting across the water and champagne flowing freely. Yet Miss Marple had observed the undercurrents, Dr. Clara Vines avoiding the drinks, Victor spiking a cocktail, Javier's sudden illness. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture remained incomplete. She returned to her chair, her mind replaying Mrs. Harrow's confession. The widow had spoken of her husband's obsession with a case from 1955, a murder in London, where a young woman had been poisoned with a rare toxin derived from a tropical plant. The suspect, a man known only as V, had vanished before he could be arrested. Detective Harrow had spent years chasing leads, convinced V had fled to the Caribbean. The colonel, a friend of Harrow's, had been involved tangentially, having met the suspect during a military posting. Mrs. Harrow believed the colonel's recognition of someone at the resort had triggered his murder. But who was V? Victor, the slick manager with a temper, Dr. Vines, with her knowledge of deadly plants, or someone else entirely, hiding behind a mask of civility? A knock at the door startled her. Miss Marple opened it to find Mrs. Harrow, her face pale against the dark backdrop of the night. She wore a simple cotton dress, its hem damp from the encroaching rain, and her eyes were wide with something between fear and determination. "Miss Marple, I couldn't sleep," Mrs. Harrow said, her voice low. "I keep thinking about what I told you. I'm afraid I've stirred something up." Miss Marple ushered her inside, gesturing to a wicker chair. "My dear, you've done the right thing by speaking out. Secrets have a way of festering, especially in a place like this. Would you like some tea? I've a small kettle here." Mrs. Harrow shook her head, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "No, thank you. I saw something tonight at the yacht party. I didn't want to say anything in front of the others, but it's been gnawing at me." Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression calm but her senses alert. "Tell me, Mrs. Harrow, what did you see?" The widow hesitated, glancing toward the window as lightning flickered in the distance. It was Victor. He was standing near the bar, pouring drinks. "I saw him slip something into a glass, a small packet of powder. I couldn't be sure, but it looked deliberate. Then Javier drank from that glass, and not 10 minutes later, he was clutching his stomach, pale as death." Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had suspected Victor's involvement in Javier's illness, but this was the first direct evidence. "Did anyone else see this?" "I don't think so," Mrs. Harrow said. "Everyone was distracted by the music and the dancing, but I couldn't look away. Victor's face, it was so cold, so calculated. I've seen that look before. In my husband's files, he described V as having eyes like a snake, watching everything." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "You've been very brave to tell me this. We must be cautious, though. Accusing someone without proof could be dangerous, especially with a storm keeping us all here." Mrs. Harrow's hands trembled. "I know, but there's more. I found something in my room this evening, tucked under my pillow. It was a photograph. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A photograph, like the one the Colonel mentioned? Not exactly, Mrs. Harrow said, reaching into her pocket. She produced a small, creased image, its edges yellowed with age. It showed a group of men in military uniforms, standing in what appeared to be a tropical setting, perhaps St. Lucian itself, decades ago. One man, partially obscured by shadow, had a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. This was with my husband's things when he died. I brought it with me, thinking it might mean something. But tonight, I noticed something else. She pointed to a figure in the background, barely visible. That's Victor. Younger, but unmistakable. The scar, the way he stands, it's him. Miss Marple examined the photograph, her heart quickening. The Colonel's diary had mentioned a face from the past, and now Mrs. Harrow had provided a tangible link. If Victor was indeed the murderer her husband had hunted, then his presence at the resort was no coincidence. But why now? And why the Colonel? This is significant, Mrs. Harrow, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. But we mustn't act rashly. Victor is clever, and if he suspects we're onto him, he may strike again. We need to keep this between us for now. Mrs. Harrow nodded, her fear tempered by resolve. What do we do next? Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind of smile that reassured while concealing the gears turning in her mind. We observe, my dear, and we wait. The storm will keep everyone indoors tonight, which gives us an opportunity. I'd like to organize a little gathering, something to bring the guests together. People reveal themselves under pressure. You see. As Mrs. Harrow left, promising to keep silent, Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched. The storm was closing in, and with it, a sense of inevitability. She needed to test her theory, to see how the guests reacted when confined together, their nerves frayed by the weather and the weight of their secrets. The next morning, the sky was a bruise of gray and purple, the wind howling through the palms. The resort's generator hummed, but power outages were imminent, the staff warned. Miss Marple, undeterred, approached the resort manager, Mr. Leclerc, with a proposal, a candlelit gathering in the main lounge to lift spirits during the storm. Mr. Leclerc, frazzled but eager to please, agreed, and by midday, invitations were sent to all guests. The lounge was a grand space, its high ceilings adorned with wooden beams and its walls lined with paintings of island life. As evening fell, the room glowed with the soft light of dozens of candles, their flames dancing in the drafts that slipped through the shutters. The guests arrived, some reluctantly, others with forced cheer. Margot Steele, the actress, wore a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, her laughter brittle. Dr. Clara Vines, her face tight, clutched a glass of water, avoiding the wine. Victor, impeccably dressed, hovered near Margot, his smile a mask. Javier, still pale from his illness, strummed a guitar softly in the corner, while Mr. Thorne, the businessman, regaled a small group with tales of his latest deal. Mrs. Harrow sat quietly, her eyes fixed on Victor, and Mr. Du Bois, the gardener, lingered near the door, his weathered hands clasped. Miss Marple, in her unassuming lavender cardigan, moved among them, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She poured tea, offered smiles, and listened, always listening. The storm raged outside, rain lashing the windows, and the candles flickered. As the generator sputtered, a sudden blackout plunged the room into near darkness, the candles casting long, wavering shadows. "Dear me," Miss Marple said lightly, breaking the tense silence. It seems the island is determined to keep us on edge. Perhaps we could share some stories to pass the time, Mr. Thorne. You must have an adventure or two to tell. Thorne chuckled, launching into a tale of a risky investment in Singapore. But Miss Marple's eyes were on Victor, who had stiffened at the mention of stories. She turned to him, her tone gentle. And you, Mr. Victor, you've traveled with Miss Steele for years, haven't you? Surely you've a tale from your past to share. Victor's smile was tight. Oh, I'm not much for storytelling, Miss Marple. My life's been rather dull, I'm afraid. Nonsense, Margot cut in, her voice sharp with wine. You've got plenty of stories, Victor. Like that time in Jamaica, when you disappeared for a week and came back with that scar. She pointed to his eyebrow, her words slurring slightly. The room stilled. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained placid. A scar, you say? That sounds intriguing. How did you come by it, Mr. Victor? Victor's hand twitched, but he recovered quickly. An accident, nothing more. A fall during a hike. Clumsy of me, double quotes Dr. Vines, who had been silent, spoke up. Her voice clipped. Accidents can be convenient, can't they? Like the Colonel's heart attack. Or poor Javier's illness last night. Javier's fingers faltered on the guitar, and all eyes turned to him. I'm fine now, he said quickly, but his gaze lingered on Victor. Wary Mrs. Harrow's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tension. Accidents do seem to follow some people, don't they? My husband used to say that coincidences are just clues in disguise. Miss Marple seized the moment. Quite right, Mrs. Harrow. And speaking of clues, I found something curious on the beach yesterday, a letter, torn and waterlogged, but it mentioned silencing the talker. Does that mean anything to anyone here? The effect was immediate. Victor's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Margot gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Vine's face paled, and even Mr. Thorne looked unsettled. Only Mr. Du Bois remained calm, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a knowing glint. Clumsy of me, Victor muttered, echoing his earlier excuse as he bent to pick up the shards. But Miss Marple was watching his hands, noting the slight tremble, the way his eyes darted to Margot. The generator sputtered back to life, flooding the room with light. The moment passed, but the air was charged. Miss Marple excused herself to fetch more tea, but in truth, she needed a moment to think. The letter, the photograph, Mrs. Harrow's story, Victor's scar, it all pointed to a man desperate to keep his past buried. But Dr. Vine's involvement couldn't be ignored, nor could Margot's silence. And Javier, his smuggling past, suggested he might know more than he let on. As she returned with the tea tray, the storm reached its peak, a deafening crack of thunder shaking the walls. The guests were restless, their conversation strained. Miss Marple decided to push further. She approached Javier, who was tuning his guitar, and lowered her voice. Javier, you've lived on this island a long time. Have you ever heard of a man called V? Someone from years ago, perhaps tied to a crime? Javier's fingers stilled. Why do you ask, Segurita? Just an old woman's curiosity, she said with a smile. But I've heard whispers of a poisoner who vanished here. And with all that's happened, well, one wonders. He hesitated, then leaned closer. There are stories, yes. A man who came to St. Lucian, maybe 20 years ago. They said he was running from something. He worked at the docks, kept to himself, had a scar. Like, he glanced at Victor, then away. But he's gone, or so they say. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions hardening. She moved to Mrs. Harrow, who was clutching the photograph in her pocket. "My dear, would you mind showing that photograph to Mr. Dubois? He knows this island better than anyone. He might recognize the setting." Mrs. Harrow agreed, and they approached the gardener, who was sipping a glass of rum. He studied the photograph, his brow furrowing. "This is the old plantation, up in the hills. Abandoned now, but it was a hub in the 50s. Smugglers used it, and worse. That man with the scar, I've seen him before. Not here, but in old pictures from the docks." The pieces were aligning, but Miss Marple needed one final push. She returned to the group, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the storm. "It's remarkable how the past follows us, isn't it? Photographs, letters, old stories, they have a way of surfacing. I wonder if anyone here has a secret they'd like to share before the storm makes it impossible to keep." Victor laughed, but it was forced. "You're quite the detective, Miss Marple. But this is a holiday, not a courtroom." "Perhaps," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "But truth has a way of coming out, like the tide. And I suspect the tide is turning." The room fell silent, save for the howl of the wind. Miss Marple felt the weight of every gaze, the tension coiling tighter. She had planted a seed, and now she would wait to see what sprouted. The storm would keep them here, and in the candlelit glow, with secrets circling like sharks, she knew the killer would make a move. She only hoped she could stay one step ahead as the night wore on. The guests dispersed to their bungalows, but Miss Marple remained in the lounge. Her knitting resumed. Mr. Dubois lingered, offering her a nod. "You're stirring the pot, miss. Be careful it doesn't boil over." She smiled. "Oh, I'm quite used to a bit of heat, Mr. Dubois, and I suspect we're close to the truth." The storm raged on, but Miss Marple felt a calm settle within her. The widow's tale had opened a door, and she was ready to step through it, come what may.